Chapter 1. The Warrant. Arthur Weasley was staying late at the Ministry again, something that had become disturbingly routine since the promotion rumors started circulating through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The misuse of Muggle Artifacts office was quiet at 9:30 on a Tuesday evening, the kind of institutional silence that made the scratch of quill on parchment sound thunderous in the empty corridor outside his door. He was reviewing a case file about a set of self-stirring cauldrons that had somehow found their way into a Muggle charity shop in Birmingham when the interdepartmental memo arrived. The enchanted paper airplane landed with unusual weight on his desk, and Arthur noticed immediately that it bore the seal of the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, specifically the Being Division. That was odd. Arthur's office rarely intersected with matters involving magical beings, unless someone had been charming household objects to torment house elves, which did happen more often than the public realized. He unfolded the memo with the careful precision of someone who had learned, through years of bureaucratic warfare, that seemingly innocent correspondence could explode in one's face. The message was brief, handwritten rather than dictated, and unsigned. Mr. Weasley, urgent matter requiring immediate investigation under Section 12 of the Child Protection Protocols. The boy who lived is currently housed with Muggles at number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Reports suggest conditions inconsistent with basic welfare standards. Recommend emergency assessment before dawn tomorrow. Time sensitive. A concerned party. Arthur read the memo twice, then a third time, his stomach dropping further with each pass. The boy who lived, Harry Potter, the child every witch and wizard in Britain knew by reputation, the infant who had somehow survived the killing curse and vanquished he who must not be named a decade ago. Arthur had never questioned, not really, what had happened to the Potter boy after that terrible Halloween night. Like most of the wizarding world, he had assumed the child was being raised somewhere safe and appropriate, surrounded by love and protection befitting his sacrifice and loss. The idea that Harry Potter might be suffering, that anyone might have the audacity to mistreat the child who had saved them all, was so fundamentally wrong that Arthur's hands were shaking as he reached for his cloak. The child protection protocols were rarely invoked. Section 12 dealt specifically with emergency intervention in cases where a magical child was being harmed by their guardians. It granted ministry officials broad authority to investigate, document, and if necessary, immediately relocate any underage witch or wizard found to be in danger. Arthur had used Section 12 exactly twice in his career, both times in cases involving magical families. He had never imagined he might need to invoke it for Harry Potter. But if the memo was accurate, if there was even a possibility that it was accurate, Arthur couldn't wait for dawn, couldn't file the proper requests and schedule an appointment through official channels. The child protection protocols existed precisely because children couldn't wait for bureaucracy. 20 minutes later, Arthur stood in the apparition point outside his own front door, key in hand, trying to determine how to wake his wife without terrifying her. It was past 10 o'clock, and Molly would be in bed already, probably with a novel and a cup of tea, enjoying the rare quiet that came when all 7 children were actually asleep. The key turned noiselessly in the lock. Arthur had charmed it years ago, after too many late nights disturbed the household, and he climbed the stairs toward their bedroom with unusual purpose. "Molly," he said softly, pushing open the door to find her exactly as he had predicted, reading by wandlight with her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up with the quick concern of a mother who had learned to interpret the emotional register of every footstep, every voice, every door closing in her house. "Arthur, what's wrong?" She was already sitting up straighter, book forgotten. "Is it one of the children? Is it—" "The children are fine," Arthur said quickly, crossing to sit on the edge of their bed. "But I need your help with something. Something urgent." He handed her the memo, watching her face change as she read. Molly's expressions were never subtle. Joy was radiant, anger was fierce, and protective fury was unmistakable. Arthur watched protective fury bloom across her features like a flower, opening to dangerous sunlight. "Harry Potter," she breathed, reading the memo a second time. "Arthur, this can't be right. Dumbledore would never. Surely someone would have—" She stopped, realizing that her protests sounded hollow, even to herself. "What exactly are we going to do about it?" "We're going to Surrey," Arthur said simply. "Tonight. I've got emergency authority under the child protection protocols to investigate and intervene if necessary. But Molly, if this is real, if that little boy is being hurt, I'm going to need someone with me who knows how to take care of children. Someone who knows what love looks like." Molly was already reaching for her dressing gown. "How long do we have?" "I want to be there by 10:30. Before midnight, certainly." "Right." Molly's voice had taken on the brisk efficiency she used during family crises, when one of the children was injured, or the house was on fire, or Fred and George had done something that required immediate damage control. "Let me just check on Ginny, and we'll go." 25 minutes later, they were walking up a perfectly ordinary suburban street in Little Whinging, Surrey, under the orange glow of street lamps that reminded Arthur forcibly of the Muggle films Molly sometimes watched when she thought no one was paying attention. Privet Drive was the sort of place where every lawn was precisely trimmed, every house looked identical, and nothing magical had ever been allowed to flourish. Number 4 was indistinguishable from its neighbours, except for the heavy curtains drawn tight across every window and the unusual number of locks visible on the front door, even from the street. "Arthur," Molly murmured, as they approached the front step. "Something feels very wrong here." Arthur felt it too. Magic left traces, and there was something off about the magical atmosphere around this house. Not dark magic, exactly, but something constrained and uncomfortable, like a too small cage or a binding that had been drawn too tight. The doorbell, when Arthur pressed it, rang with the shrill persistence of a fire alarm. He could hear movement inside the house immediately. Hurried footsteps, urgent whispers, what sounded like furniture being moved. Then heavy footsteps approached the front door, and it opened to reveal the largest man Arthur had ever seen outside of a giant encampment. Vernon Dursley was purple in the face and breathing heavily, as if he had been running. His small, dark eyes moved quickly between Arthur and Molly, taking in their distinctly non-suburban clothing with obvious alarm. "We're not interested," Vernon said immediately, beginning to close the door. "Whatever you're selling, we don't want any." "Mr. Dursley," Arthur said, producing the official warrant from his robes with the sort of calm authority that came from years of practice. "I'm Arthur Weasley from the Ministry of Magic, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. This is my wife, Molly. We're here to conduct a welfare check on Harry Potter under Section 12 of the Child Protection Protocols." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Vernon Dursley's face went from purple to grey, his mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a fish, and behind him Arthur could hear a woman's voice saying, "Vernon! Vernon, what is it? Who's there?" "You can't," Vernon stammered, gripping the doorframe. "You can't just— We haven't done anything wrong. The boy is fine. He's perfectly fine. He's—" "Sir," Arthur interrupted gently, "may we come in? This is a formal investigation, and I'm afraid I do have the legal authority to insist." What followed was perhaps the most uncomfortable 10 minutes of Arthur's professional career, as he and Molly were reluctantly admitted into a house that radiated hostility and fear. Petunia Dursley appeared in the hallway like a scarecrow in a housecoat, her thin face pinched with panic, while an enormous boy Arthur's age recognized must be their son Dudley peered down from the upstairs landing. "Where is Harry?" Molly asked directly, cutting through Vernon's blustering attempts to explain why this was all a mistake, why they hadn't done anything wrong, why the Ministry had no business here. "He's asleep," Petunia said quickly. "Upstairs, he's been asleep for hours. You can't just wake him up and frighten him with all this nonsense about magic and—" "He sleeps upstairs?" Arthur asked, noting the way both adults exchanged glances. "Well, not exactly upstairs, but where does Harry sleep, Mrs. Dursley?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Arthur felt something cold and terrible settling in his stomach as he looked around the pristine sitting room, noting the family photographs that covered every surface, dozens of pictures of Dudley at various ages, but not a single image of Harry Potter anywhere. "I need to see his room," Arthur said quietly. "You can't just—" "I can, and I will. Mrs. Dursley, where does Harry Potter sleep in this house?" Petunia's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before she pointed, with obvious reluctance, toward a door Arthur had assumed led to a broom closet. It did lead to a broom closet. A broom closet in which a 10-year-old boy was sleeping on a thin mattress surrounded by cleaning supplies, with a small pile of much too large clothes in one corner and what appeared to be a few broken toys that had clearly been discarded by someone else. Arthur heard Molly's sharp intake of breath behind him, heard her whisper, "Oh my God." "Arthur, look at him." Harry Potter was small, smaller than Ron, smaller than Arthur remembered any 11-year-old being, with visible ribs beneath a t-shirt that could have fit Dudley twice over. His dark hair was much longer than any child's hair should be, as if no one had bothered to cut it in months, and even in sleep his face held a tension that spoke of constant wariness. There were locks on the outside of the door. Multiple locks. "Wake up, Harry," Molly said softly, kneeling beside the mattress. "Wake up, sweetheart." Harry Potter opened startlingly green eyes and focused on Molly with the immediate, total alertness of a child who had learned that being caught asleep could be dangerous. He sat up quickly, pressing himself against the wall, and Arthur watched him take in the crowded closet, the two strange adults, the open door. "I'm sorry," Harry said immediately, his voice hoarse from sleep. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to oversleep. I'll start breakfast right now, I just—" "Harry," Molly interrupted gently, "you haven't done anything wrong. We're here to help you." "I don't understand," Harry said, looking from Molly to Arthur with obvious confusion. "Who are you? Why are you in my cupboard?" Arthur felt something break apart inside his chest. The boy who lived didn't know who they were, didn't know what they were, had no idea that magic existed, that he was famous, that an entire world had been celebrating his survival for 10 years while he slept in a closet and apologized for existing. "We're going to get you out of here," Arthur said, his voice rougher than he had intended. "Right now." Behind them, Vernon Dursley was speaking in urgent, panicked tones about legal guardianship and proper procedures, and how this was all highly irregular. But Arthur was no longer listening. He was looking at Harry Potter, really looking at him, and seeing every sign of chronic neglect and fear that his years in the Ministry had taught him to recognize. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was exactly what the anonymous memo had warned him he would find. "Arthur," Molly said quietly, still kneeling beside Harry. "We need to take him home." "I know," Arthur replied, already reaching for the emergency relocation forms in his robes. "Harry, can you walk? Can you pack your things?" "My things," Harry repeated, as if the concept were foreign. "Your clothes, your books, anything that belongs to you." Harry looked around the closet with obvious confusion. "This is all my things," he said finally, gesturing to the pile of oversized clothes. "I don't have any books." Arthur felt his anger crystallize into something cold and precise, and absolutely implacable. He had spent his career dealing with magical creatures and charmed objects and complex international regulations, but nothing had prepared him for the fury of discovering that Harry Potter, had been treated like something less than human for 10 years while the wizarding world celebrated his sacrifice. "Molly," he said, "please help Harry get dressed and gather his things. I need to have a conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Dursley about what happens next." The conversation was brief, official, and unambiguous. Arthur documented everything with the sort of meticulous care he usually reserved for dangerous dark arts items, noting the locks, the size of the sleeping area, the lack of personal belongings, Harry's obvious malnourishment and fearful responses. The Dursleys' protests became increasingly frantic as they realized that Arthur was not going to be convinced, bribed, or intimidated into leaving Harry with them. By 25 minutes past 11, Harry Potter was sitting in the back seat of a ministry vehicle beside Molly Weasley, wearing clothes that actually fit him, and clutching a small bag containing everything he owned in the world. He had not stopped looking confused since they'd found him, but he was no longer apologizing for existing, which Arthur considered progress. "Where are we going?" Harry asked quietly as the car pulled away from Privet Drive. "Home," Molly said simply, reaching over to smooth his too long hair. "We're taking you home." Arthur glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Harry Potter, small and bewildered, but finally safe, nodding as if the word home were something he had always hoped existed, but never quite believed he would find. The warrant tucked into Arthur's robes bore tomorrow's date, but Arthur knew that tonight's work was the most important thing his office had ever accomplished. Chapter 2. Before Dumbledore arrives. Harry Potter had never been in a car that moved without an engine running. He had never seen a woman heal cuts and bruises by touching them with a wooden stick. He had never had anyone look at him with the sort of fierce, protective concern that blazed in Molly Weasley's eyes as she knelt beside him in the back seat of the ministry vehicle, murmuring what sounded like incantations while warmth spread through his aching ribs. "Magic," he whispered, watching a particularly nasty bruise on his forearm fade to nothing under her touch. "This is really magic." "Yes, sweetheart," Molly said softly, moving her wand to check his too thin wrists for signs of rope burns. She found them, of course, and Harry watched her face go very still in a way that reminded him of the moment before a thunderstorm. "This is magic, and you're a wizard, Harry. A very famous wizard." Harry looked from Molly to Arthur, who was bent over an official-looking piece of parchment in the front seat, making notes with a quill that seemed to be writing by itself. The car continued to glide silently through the empty streets of Little Whinging, and Harry realized that nothing about this night was going to make sense in any way he understood sense. "I don't know what that means," he said honestly. "Famous wizard. I don't know what any of this means." Arthur turned in his seat to face Harry, and his expression was so gentle and sad that Harry felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "What did the Dursleys tell you about your parents, Harry?" "They said they died in a car crash," Harry replied automatically. "They said my dad was a drunk and my mum was a freak, and they died because they were worthless and—" He stopped, because Molly had made a sound like a wounded animal. "Harry," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "none of that is true. None of it." "Your parents were James and Lily Potter," Arthur said quietly. "They were murdered by a very dark wizard named Voldemort when you were 15 months old. They died protecting you. Your mother's love saved your life. And when Voldemort tried to kill you, the curse rebounded and destroyed him instead. That's why you're famous, Harry. You're the boy who lived." Harry stared at Arthur, trying to process words that seemed too large and strange to fit inside his head. Murdered, he repeated slowly. Someone murdered my parents. Yes, Molly said, her hand still resting on his shoulder. And then someone decided you should be raised by people who would hurt you and lie to you about who you are. But that's over now, Harry. I promise you, that's over. Arthur's quick quotes. Quill was moving rapidly across the parchment, documenting everything Harry had told them about his treatment, everything they had observed at Privet Drive. Harry watched the quill work with fascination, but part of his mind was still trying to understand what he had just learned. The man who killed my parents, he said slowly. He tried to kill me too. Yes, Arthur said, but you survived. You're the only person who has ever survived the killing curse, and that made you very famous in our world. Every witch and wizard in Britain knows your name. Harry touched the scar on his forehead unconsciously. He had always wondered about the lightning bolt-shaped mark, had been told it came from the car crash. Another lie. Everything had been lies. Harry, Molly said gently. Are you all right? I know this is a great deal to take in. Harry considered this. He was not all right, exactly. He was hungry and confused, and his entire understanding of reality had just been turned inside out. But for the first time in his life, he was sitting next to people who seemed to actually care whether he was all right or not, and that was so unprecedented that he hardly knew how to respond. I think so, he said finally. It's just, why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't anyone come for me before now? The question hung in the air like something heavy and sharp, and Harry watched Arthur and Molly exchange a look that told him the answer to that question was complicated and probably not pleasant. That, Arthur said grimly, is something we're going to have to discuss with. He was interrupted by a soft popping sound from somewhere nearby, followed immediately by the sensation of very powerful magic settling over the car like a blanket. Harry felt his skin prickle, though he didn't understand why, and noticed that both Arthur and Molly had gone very tense. Arthur, Molly said quietly, we need to go. Now. But before Arthur could respond, there was a gentle knock on the car window, and Harry turned to see the strangest man he had ever encountered. He was very tall and very old, with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles, wearing robes that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. His eyes were bright blue and twinkling with what might have been kindness, but there was something else there too. Surprise, and perhaps disappointment. Arthur rolled down the window with obvious reluctance. Albus, he said carefully. Arthur. Molly. The old man's voice was warm and grandfatherly, but Harry could hear an undercurrent of steel beneath the pleasantness. I believe you have something that belongs with me. I have a child who belongs with people who won't lock him in a cupboard and starve him, Molly said sharply. That's what I have. The old man, Albus, looked past Arthur and Molly to focus on Harry with those unnervingly bright eyes. Harry felt as though he was being studied, measured, evaluated in some way he couldn't understand. Harry Potter, Albus said softly. My boy, I am so very sorry that you have been frightened tonight. I am Professor Dumbledore, and I have been very worried about you. You have? Harry asked, confused. This was the first he had heard of anyone being worried about him. Oh yes, Dumbledore said kindly. I have been watching over you from afar, making certain you were safe and protected. And now I think it would be best if you came with me, so that we might discuss your future properly. Harry looked to Arthur and Molly uncertainly. Arthur's hands were clenched on the steering wheel, and Molly had moved slightly so that she was positioned between Harry and the window. Professor, Arthur said with careful formality, I'm acting under the authority of Section 12 of the Child Protection Protocols. I have documented evidence of severe neglect and abuse, and I have legal custody of this child until the matter can be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. Dumbledore's expression remained pleasant, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Arthur, I understand your concern, but you must realize that Harry's situation is far more complex than standard ministry protocols can address. There are protections in place, ancient magic that requires his presence at Privet Drive. Surely you can see that removing him from his relative's home endangers not only Harry himself, but potentially the entire wizarding world." "The entire wizarding world can bloody well find another way to protect itself," Molly snapped, "because I am not sending this child back to people who locked him in a cupboard." Harry watched this exchange with growing alarm. The adults were talking about him as if he wasn't there, making decisions about his life without asking what he wanted or how he felt. It was exactly what the Dursleys had always done, except now the stakes seemed much higher and much more complicated. "Excuse me," he said quietly, and all three adults turned to look at him. "Could someone please explain what's happening? Because I still don't understand why I've been living with people who hate me, or who any of you are, or what these protections are that apparently require me to be miserable." Dumbledore's expression softened into something that might have been genuine regret. "Harry, my dear boy, I know this is confusing. Your aunt and uncle were chosen to care for you because your mother's blood runs in Petunia's veins, and that creates a powerful protection while you are young. As long as you can call their house your home, you are shielded from those who would do you harm." "But they do harm me," Harry said, confused. "They've been harming me for years." "Physical discomfort is temporary," Dumbledore said gently. "Death is permanent. I made the choice to prioritize your survival over your comfort, and I would make the same choice again." Harry stared at him. "You knew," he said slowly. "You knew they were hurting me, and you left me there anyway." "I believed it was for the greater good." "Whose good?" Molly demanded furiously. "Certainly not Harry's." Arthur's voice was very quiet and very dangerous when he spoke. "Professor, with respect, your personal beliefs about the greater good do not supersede ministry law regarding child welfare. I have documented evidence of serious abuse and neglect. Harry Potter is coming with us tonight, and tomorrow we will begin the process of finding him a proper home with people who will actually care for his well-being." "Arthur," Dumbledore said, and now the steel in his voice was more obvious, "you are making a grave mistake. There are forces at work here that you do not understand, enemies who have been waiting 10 years for exactly this sort of opportunity. If you remove Harry from the protections I have put in place, then we'll find other protections," Arthur interrupted. "Legal ones. Official ones. Protections that don't require child abuse as a prerequisite." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, studying Arthur's face. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "I'm afraid I cannot allow this." "And I'm afraid you don't have a choice," Arthur replied, producing the official warrant from his robes. "This is a legal document, Professor, signed by the appropriate authorities, granting me emergency custody of Harry Potter, pending investigation into his living conditions. If you interfere with an official ministry investigation, I will have you arrested." Harry watched Dumbledore's face carefully, trying to understand the emotions that flickered across it. Surprise was there, and frustration, but also something that might have been respect. "You would arrest me," Dumbledore said slowly, "to protect one child." "I would arrest anyone," Arthur said firmly, "to protect any child. That's what the law is for, Professor, to protect people who can't protect themselves. Even if that child is Harry Potter, even if removing him from his current situation potentially endangers everyone you love." Arthur didn't hesitate. Especially then. Harry felt something warm and unfamiliar spread through his chest as he watched Arthur face down the most powerful wizard he had ever encountered, the most powerful wizard he had ever heard of, according to the Dursleys' fearful whispers. For his sake. Nobody had ever stood up for him before. Nobody had ever risked anything for him. "Mr. Weasley," he said quietly. "Mrs. Weasley, thank you." Molly's hand found his and squeezed gently. "Oh, Harry," she said softly, "you don't need to thank us for doing what's right." Dumbledore stepped back from the car window, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said finally. "I can see that you are quite determined in this course of action. But Arthur, Molly, I hope you understand that you are taking on a responsibility that extends far beyond one child's immediate comfort. Harry Potter's fate is intertwined with the fate of our entire world." "Then our entire world had better learn to protect him properly," Molly said fiercely. "Because I promise you, Professor, I will not let anyone hurt this boy again. Not the Dursleys, not mysterious enemies, and not you." Arthur started the car's engine, which roared to life normally now, Harry noticed, as if the magic that had been sustaining it had been withdrawn. "We'll be in touch through official channels, Professor," Arthur said politely. "Good evening." As they drove away, Harry turned to watch Dumbledore standing alone under a street lamp, his tall figure growing smaller in the distance. The old man looked suddenly frail and tired, and Harry felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for him. "Is he really trying to keep me safe?" Harry asked quietly. "He believes he is," Arthur said after a moment. "But Harry, good intentions don't excuse harmful actions, and they certainly don't excuse lying to you about who you are and what happened to your family." Harry nodded, turning back to face forward as they left little whinging behind. Through the car window, he could see the first faint lightening of dawn on the horizon. In a few hours it would be August 1st, and he would be 11 years old. For the first time in his life, he was looking forward to his birthday. "Mrs. Weasley," he said softly. "What happens now?" Molly smiled at him, and it was the warmest, most genuine expression Harry had ever seen directed at himself. "Now you come home with us, Harry, and tomorrow we start figuring out what kind of life you actually want to have." Harry leaned back against the car seat and closed his eyes, feeling safer than he had ever felt in his life. Behind them, little whinging disappeared into the darkness, and ahead of them, something that might actually be home waited in the growing light of dawn. The warrant in Arthur's pocket was still warm with official magic, and Harry Potter was finally, truly free. Chapter 3. Sanctuary at the Burrow. The Burrow appeared in the pre-dawn light, like something from a dream Harry might have had if he had ever been allowed to dream about good things. It was tall and crooked, and looked as though it had been built by someone who cared more about making room for a large family than about architectural logic. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, warm light glowed in several windows despite the early hour, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly, as if it were bending down to welcome them home. "It's not much," Molly said apologetically, as Arthur parked the ministry car beside a chicken coop that was definitely larger than Harry's former cupboard. "But it's home." Harry stared up at the impossible house, counting at least 4 stories that seemed to balance on top of each other through sheer determination rather than engineering principles. "It's wonderful," he breathed, and meant it completely. The front door opened before they reached it, spilling golden light and the sound of urgent voices into the grey dawn air. A boy who looked exactly Harry's age appeared in the doorway, his red hair mussed from sleep, and his pajamas obviously thrown on hastily. "Mum?" the boy called out, squinting in their direction. "Dad? What's—" He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes found Harry, and his mouth fell open slightly. "Blimey. You're him, aren't you? You're Harry Potter." "Ron," Molly said gently, "this is Harry. Harry, this is our youngest son, Ron. He'll be starting Hogwarts with you in September." Harry looked at Ron uncertainly. He was still trying to adjust to the idea that people knew who he was, that his name meant something to children he had never met. "Hello," he said quietly. "Brilliant," Ron said with obvious excitement, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, are you all right? Fred and George said they heard Dad leaving in the middle of the night, and then Mum was gone too, and Percy said there must have been an emergency at the ministry, but nobody would tell us anything." "There was an emergency," Arthur said grimly, guiding Harry toward the front door. "But it's been resolved. Harry will be staying with us for a while." The house was even more wonderful on the inside than it had appeared from the road. The kitchen was warm and cluttered and smelled like bread and herbs and something indefinably comforting that Harry thought might just be the smell of a place where people were happy. A clock on the wall had 9 hands and locations like home and work and mortal peril instead of numbers, and Harry could see magic everywhere, in the self-stirring pot on the stove, the dishes washing themselves in the sink, the knitting needles clicking away at what looked like a jumper without any human guidance. "Sit down, Harry," Molly said, pulling out a chair at the scarred wooden table. "Let me get you something to eat." Before Harry could protest that he wasn't hungry, a lifetime habit of never expecting to be fed, the kitchen was filling with people. Twin boys who looked slightly older than Ron came thundering down the stairs, identical except for the fact that one had a small bandage on his nose. "Is it really him?" one of them asked breathlessly. "The Harry Potter?" asked the other. "Fred, George, please," Molly said, though Harry noticed she was smiling. "Give the boy some space to breathe." A thin boy with horn-rimmed glasses appeared more quietly, already fully dressed despite the early hour. He looked older than the twins, with the serious air of someone who had been awakened by family emergencies before and knew how to respond appropriately. "I'm Percy," he said formally, extending his hand to Harry. "Percy Weasley. I'm very pleased to meet you, Harry, and I want you to know that if you need anything while you're staying with us, please don't hesitate to ask." Harry shook Percy's hand, overwhelmed by the sudden presence of so many people who all seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Thank you," he managed. "Where's Ginny?" Molly asked, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of Harry that was larger than any meal he had ever been served. "Still asleep," Ron said. "Should we wake her?" "Let her sleep," Arthur said gently. "There will be time for introductions later." Harry picked at his breakfast, under the curious but not unkind stares of the Weasley children, trying to process the surreal experience of being surrounded by people who seemed to think his presence was a good thing. The twins, Fred and George, kept whispering to each other and shooting him looks that were excited rather than suspicious. Ron was sitting beside him, clearly bursting with questions, but apparently trying to be polite. Percy had taken a seat across from them, and was watching Harry with the sort of careful attention that suggested he was memorizing the experience for later analysis. "Harry," Molly said gently, "you don't have to eat everything if you're not hungry, but you should try to have something." "It's very good," Harry said quickly, taking a larger bite. "It's just, this is more than I usually eat in a day." The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Harry realized too late that he had said something wrong, something that revealed more about his life at the Dursleys than he had intended. He looked around the table and saw various expressions of shock, anger, and what might have been pity. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean—" "Harry," Arthur interrupted gently. "You never need to apologize for telling the truth, and you never need to apologize for what was done to you." "Dad's right," Ron said fiercely. "If someone wasn't feeding you properly, that's their fault, not yours." "Too right," said Fred, or possibly George. "Absolutely right," agreed George, or possibly Fred. Harry felt his throat tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. These people, these strangers, were angry on his behalf. It was a concept so foreign that he hardly knew how to respond to it. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp tapping at the kitchen window. Arthur stood to admit a large, tawny owl carrying an official-looking letter, but before he could reach the window, there was a second, sharp crack from somewhere outside, followed immediately by rapid footsteps on the front path. "That'll be Bill," Molly said, rising quickly from the table. "I sent him an emergency owl. The front door opened with enough force to rattle the hinges, and a young man with long red hair and an earring appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was tall and lean, and had the sort of tan that came from working outdoors in hot climates, but his face was pale with obvious worry. "What's happened?" he demanded, his eyes moving quickly around the room until they found Arthur and Molly, then settling on Harry with obvious confusion. "I got your owl saying there was a family emergency, and I took the first portkey out of Cairo. Is everyone all right? Who?" He stopped, staring at Harry. "Is that?" "This is Harry Potter," Molly said quietly. "Harry, this is our oldest son, Bill. He works as a curse breaker for Gringotts in Egypt." Bill looked from Harry to his parents, clearly trying to piece together a situation that made no immediate sense. "Right," he said slowly. "And Harry Potter is sitting in our kitchen at dawn because, Arthur said grimly, "Harry Potter was being abused by his Muggle relatives, and we removed him from their custody last night under emergency ministry protocols." The change in Bill's expression was immediate and dramatic. The confusion vanished, replaced by the sort of cold fury that Harry was beginning to recognize as a Weasley family trait when it came to protecting children. "I see," Bill said quietly, and his voice carried the same dangerous undertone that Arthur's had used with Dumbledore. "And where are these relatives now?" "Still in Surrey," Arthur replied. "Under ministry investigation." "Good." Bill pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, his attention focusing on Harry with gentle curiosity. "Well then, Harry Potter, I'm very glad to meet you, and I'm very sorry about whatever brought you here. But I want you to know that you're safe now. This family doesn't let anyone hurt children. Not ever." "Thank you," Harry said quietly, looking around the table at all the faces watching him with varying degrees of protectiveness and welcome. "I still don't quite understand what's happening, but thank you." "What's happening," Molly said firmly, "is that you're having breakfast with your family. And after breakfast, we're going to get you properly settled, and then we're going to start figuring out what you need to know before you start school in September." "My family?" Harry repeated uncertainly. "If you want us to be," Ron said quickly. "I mean, if you want to stay, you could share my room, and we could practice Quidditch in the orchard, and I could teach you about wizard chess and—" "Ron," Percy interrupted gently. "Let Harry catch his breath." But Harry was looking at Ron with something like wonder. "You want me to stay?" he asked. "Of course we do," Fred said immediately. "You're brilliant," George added. "You survived the killing curse," Percy said with obvious admiration. "That's the most remarkable magical feat in recorded history." "Percy," Molly warned. "What? It's true." "What they mean," Bill said with a slight smile, "is that you're welcome here for as long as you want to stay. Fame aside, just because you're you." Harry stared at him. "You don't even know who I am." "We know you've been hurt, and we know you need somewhere safe," Arthur said simply. "That's enough for us." Harry felt his eyes burning with tears he didn't understand. Nobody had ever wanted him before. Nobody had ever offered him a place to belong just because they thought he deserved one. "Could I really stay?" he asked quietly. "I mean, I don't know anything about your world. I don't know how to do magic, or what Quidditch is, or what I'm supposed to learn before school. I'd probably just be in the way." "Harry," Molly said softly, "you could never be in the way. And as for the rest of it, well, that's what family is for. To teach you the things you need to know and help you figure out who you want to be." The word family hung in the air like a promise, and Harry felt something that had been twisted tight in his chest for as long as he could remember begin to slowly unfold. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like that very much." "Excellent," Ron said with obvious delight. "Brilliant. This is going to be the best summer ever." Later, after Harry had been shown to Ron's room and given a proper bed with clean sheets and a window that actually opened, after he had been introduced to a sleepy 9-year-old girl named Ginny, who had blushed scarlet and hidden behind her mother upon seeing him, after he had been overwhelmed by the simple experience of being included in a family that argued and laughed and treated his presence as a gift rather than a burden. After all of that, Harry lay in the narrow bed that Ron had cheerfully made up for him and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a house full of people who cared about each other. Through the thin walls, he could hear Arthur and Molly talking quietly in their room, could catch fragments of words like documentation and legal proceedings and that poor child. From downstairs came the faint sound of Bill and Percy discussing something in low, serious tones. Even the twins seemed to have settled down for what remained of the night, though Harry suspected they were plotting something involving the interesting collection of items he had seen them hastily shoving under George's bed earlier. For the first time in his life, Harry was surrounded by people who wanted him there. For the first time in his life, he was safe. "Harry?" Ron's voice came quietly from the darkness across the room. "Yeah. I'm really glad you're here." Harry smiled into his pillow. "Me too." Outside the window, the sun was rising on Harry Potter's 11th birthday, and for the first time in 11 years, it felt like something worth celebrating. Downstairs, Arthur Weasley continued working on his official report by wandlight, documenting every detail of Harry Potter's rescue with the meticulous care of a man who intended to ensure that justice was served. And in the kitchen, Molly Weasley sat at the scarred wooden table with a cup of tea, growing cold in her hands, crying quietly for the childhood that had been stolen from the boy sleeping safely upstairs, and promising herself that no one would ever hurt him again. The Burrow had gained a new member, and the Weasley family had gained a son. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Harry Potter was finally, truly home. Chapter 4. The Ministry Investigation. Arthur Weasley had been awake for 36 hours straight, but his hands were steady as he arranged the documentation on the polished conference table in Meeting Room 7 of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The photographs taken at Privet Drive lay in neat rows beside his written report, and the quick quotes quill transcription of Harry's initial statements sat in a separate folder marked with official seals. He had called this meeting for 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 days after Harry Potter's rescue, and the attendees were filing in with the sort of careful expressions that suggested everyone was very aware that careers could be made or destroyed by how this matter was handled. "Arthur," said Cornelius Fudge, as he settled his considerable bulk into the chair at the head of the table, "I do hope you realize the gravity of what you're alleging here. These are very serious accusations against some very prominent people." "Minister," Arthur replied with the careful formality he reserved for interactions with politicians, "these are very serious crimes against a child. The prominence of the perpetrators is irrelevant." Fudge's expression soured slightly. "Yes, well, we mustn't be hasty about throwing around words like crimes until we've had a chance to review all the facts. Surely there's been some misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding," interrupted a crisp voice from the doorway. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, entered the room with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested she had little patience for political delicacy. "I've reviewed Mr. Weasley's preliminary report, Minister, and the evidence is quite clear. This is a case of systematic child abuse, and it falls under my department's jurisdiction for investigation." Fudge's face went slightly pale. "Amelia, surely we can handle this internally, quietly. There's no need to involve your department's formal investigative procedures. Think of the publicity." "I am thinking of the child," Amelia said sharply, taking her seat and opening a thick file folder. "And I am thinking of the law. Mr. Weasley, please present your evidence." Arthur stood, grateful for Amelia's support, but knowing that the real challenge was only beginning. 2 nights ago, I received an anonymous tip regarding the welfare of Harry Potter, currently placed with his Muggle relatives at 4 Privet Drive in Surrey. Acting under Section 12 of the Child Protection Protocols, I obtained an emergency warrant and conducted an immediate investigation." He gestured to the photographs spread across the table. "These images document Mr. Potter's living conditions. As you can see, he was housed in a cupboard under the stairs, approximately 4 feet by 7 feet, with no window and multiple external locks. The bedding consisted of a thin mattress and a single blanket. His possessions fit in a bag smaller than what most wizarding families use for a weekend trip." The silence in the room was heavy. Even Fudge seemed unable to formulate an immediate objection to what the photographs clearly showed. The medical examination conducted by my wife, a qualified healer, documented evidence of chronic malnutrition, multiple healed fractures that were never properly treated, and psychological trauma consistent with long-term emotional abuse. Arthur's voice remained level, professional, but there was steel underneath. Mr. Potter had no knowledge of his magical heritage, his parents' true fate, or his own significance in our world. He believed his parents died in a car crash because they were worthless drunks. "Surely," Fudge interjected weakly, "the boy was simply being protected from information he was too young to understand." "Minister," Amelia interrupted, studying the photographs with obvious disgust, "this child was being systematically abused. The evidence is overwhelming. Mr. Weasley, what is your recommendation?" "Formal charges should be filed against Vernon and Petunia Dursley for child abuse, child endangerment, and willful neglect. Additionally, I recommend a full investigation into how this placement was arranged and why no follow-up monitoring was conducted for 10 years. Fudge's political instincts finally seemed to activate. "An investigation into the placement? Arthur, you can't be serious. Professor Dumbledore arranged that placement. Surely you're not suggesting that the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, would—" "I'm suggesting," Arthur said quietly, "that someone placed a magical child in an abusive situation and then failed to monitor his welfare for a decade. I'm suggesting that this represents a catastrophic failure of our child protection systems, and I'm suggesting that we investigate how it happened so we can ensure it never happens again. I'll need to speak with Professor Dumbledore before we proceed with any formal charges," Fudge said quickly. "This is all very sensitive, politically speaking. Perhaps there are aspects of the situation that we don't fully understand." "Minister," Amelia said with dangerous calm, "are you suggesting that we delay filing charges against child abusers because it might be politically inconvenient?" Before Fudge could answer, there was a soft knock on the conference room door, and Kingsley Shacklebolt appeared with a tall, stern-looking woman whose emerald robes were impeccable despite the early hour. "Professor McGonagall," Amelia said, rising. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Minerva McGonagall took the offered chair with visible reluctance, her lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed the evidence spread across the table. "Mr. Weasley," she said quietly, "I understand you wish me to provide testimony regarding Mr. Potter's placement with his relatives. If you would, Professor. You were present when the decision was made." McGonagall's expression tightened further. "I was present when Professor Dumbledore made the decision. Yes, I was not consulted about it." "And what were your thoughts on the placement at the time?" There was a long pause before McGonagall answered. "I expressed concerns," she said carefully. "I had observed the Dursley family for a full day prior to the placement, and I found them to be unsuitable guardians for any child, let alone one with Mr. Potter's unique circumstances." "You expressed these concerns to Professor Dumbledore?" Amelia asked. "I did. He assured me that the placement was necessary for Mr. Potter's protection, and that the family would grow to love him as their own." McGonagall's voice carried a bitter edge. "It appears that assessment was optimistic." Fudge was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Professor McGonagall, surely you understand that Professor Dumbledore's decision was made with the best of intentions. The war had just ended. Emotions were running high." "Minister," McGonagall interrupted with icy precision, Good intentions do not excuse the consequences we see documented in these photographs. I have been a teacher for 30 years. I know what an abused child looks like, and I know what failed duty of care looks like. This is both. Arthur felt a surge of gratitude toward the stern Transfiguration professor. Her testimony carried weight that his own could not, given her position and her long-standing relationship with Dumbledore. "Professor," he said gently, "in your professional opinion, should there have been follow-up monitoring of Mr. Potter's placement?" "Absolutely." McGonagall's answer was immediate and unequivocal. At minimum, quarterly visits should have been conducted, preferably monthly, given the unusual circumstances. The fact that no such monitoring occurred represents a fundamental failure of our responsibility to a child in our care. The door to the conference room opened again, and Arthur looked up to see a woman with elaborate blonde curls and jeweled spectacles sweeping into the room with the confidence of someone who knew she had every right to be there. "Minister Fudge!" Rita Skeeter exclaimed brightly, her quick quotes quill already hovering expectantly. "What a delight to see you this morning. I understand there's been some excitement regarding our beloved boy who lived. The public has such a right to know about matters affecting their hero." Fudge went pale. "Miss Skeeter, this is a closed session." "Oh, but Minister," Rita continued with false sweetness, "surely there's no harm in keeping the wizarding public informed about matters of such obvious public interest. After all, we wouldn't want rumors to spread when the truth is so much more illuminating." Arthur realized immediately that Rita Skeeter's presence was no accident. Someone had tipped her off, which meant that someone wanted this story in the public eye, despite Fudge's obvious preference for handling it quietly. "Miss Skeeter," Amelia said calmly, "while I appreciate the press's interest in matters of public concern, this is an ongoing investigation involving a minor child. I'm afraid you'll need to wait for our official statement." "Oh, but I've already spoken with several sources," Rita said airily, "and the story emerging is quite fascinating. The boy who lived, rescued from terrible abuse by a heroic ministry official, the brave family who took him in, the questions being raised about how such abuse was allowed to continue undetected for so many years." Her quick quotes quill was scribbling furiously. "The public will be absolutely captivated." Fudge looked as though he might faint. "Miss Skeeter, surely we can discuss this privately." "I'm afraid the story is already written, Minister. It will be in tomorrow's edition of the Daily Prophet, front page, naturally. Boy who lived rescued from abusive muggles. Ministry investigation raises questions about placement decisions." Such a compelling headline, don't you think? Arthur watched this exchange with mixed feelings. On one hand, publicity would make it much harder for the ministry to quietly sweep Harry's abuse under the metaphorical carpet. On the other hand, Harry was still a traumatized 11-year-old who deserved privacy and protection, not sensational headlines. "If you'll excuse me," he said, standing. "I believe it's time for Mr. Potter's formal interview. The sooner we complete our investigation, the sooner appropriate action can be taken." 2 hours later, Arthur was sitting in a much smaller room with Harry, Molly, and an official ministry stenographer, trying to help an 11-year-old boy understand why he needed to describe the worst experiences of his life in precise detail for a formal record. "I know this is difficult, Harry," Arthur said gently, "but it's important that we have your account of what happened. The more complete our documentation, the stronger our case will be." Harry sat beside Molly, his hands folded carefully in his lap, looking much younger than his 11 years in the formal ministry setting. "I still don't understand why this matters so much to everyone. I thought all children lived like I did." "Oh, sweetheart," Molly said softly. "No. Children should be loved and cared for and protected. What the Dursleys did to you was wrong, and it was illegal, and people need to be held accountable for it." "But what if—" Harry paused, struggling with something. What if Professor Dumbledore was right? What if I needed to stay there for protection? What if people get hurt because I'm not there anymore? Arthur felt his heart break a little at the question. Even after everything, Harry was worried about being responsible for other people's safety. Harry, protecting you from dark wizards doesn't require anyone to hurt you. There are other ways to keep people safe, ways that don't involve locking children in cupboards. The stenographer will record everything you tell us, Arthur explained, and that record will be used to make sure the right decisions are made about your future. But Harry, I want you to understand something very important. You are not responsible for what the Dursleys did to you. You were a child. You deserved better. Harry nodded slowly and began to talk. He spoke quietly and carefully about years of hunger, of sleeping in a cupboard, of being blamed for things he didn't understand, of being told he was a freak and a burden. He described Dudley's games of Harry hunting and Vernon's explosive rages and Petunia's cold, bitter silences. Arthur documented every word, his professional composure never slipping, even as his personal fury grew with each revelation. By the time Harry finished, Arthur was absolutely certain that no political consideration, no matter how compelling, could justify allowing this to continue or go unpunished. "Thank you, Harry," Arthur said when the interview was complete. "I know that was very difficult, but what you've told us today will help make sure that you're safe and that other children are protected too." As they left the ministry, Arthur thought about Rita Skeeter's headline and Fudge's political panic and Dumbledore's inevitable response to having his decision-making questioned so publicly. Tomorrow, the entire wizarding world would know that Harry Potter had been rescued from abuse, and that would change everything. But tonight, Harry Potter would sleep safely at the Burrow, surrounded by people who loved him. And for Arthur Weasley, that made every political complication worth facing. "Dad," Harry said quietly as they walked through the ministry atrium. "What happens now?" Arthur looked down at the boy who had survived so much and was still worried about causing trouble for others. "Now we make sure you're safe," he said simply. "Whatever else happens, that comes first." Harry nodded, and Arthur noticed that some of the tension had gone out of his shoulders. For the first time since this began, Harry seemed to believe that someone was actually going to protect him. The investigation would continue, the political fallout would intensify, and the wizarding world would have many difficult conversations about how they had failed their greatest hero. But Harry Potter was safe, and that was what mattered most. Everything else they would figure out as they went. Chapter 5. Revelations and Resistance. Albus Dumbledore had been the chief warlock of the Wizengamot for longer than most witches and wizards had been alive, and he understood the delicate mechanics of political influence better than anyone in the British magical government, which was why he was sitting in Minister Fudge's private office at 7 o'clock in the morning, 3 days after Harry Potter's rescue, with a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and a careful expression of paternal concern. "Cornelius," he said softly, "I fear that Arthur Weasley, well-intentioned though he certainly is, may not fully comprehend the complexities of young Harry's situation." Fudge was sweating despite the early hour, his round face creased with the sort of panic that came from realizing that one's political survival was hanging by a thread. "Albus, the photographs, the evidence Arthur presented. How am I supposed to explain this to the Wizengamot? To the public? The Daily Prophet is having a field day with headlines about the boy who lived being rescued from abuse. My office has received over 300 howlers since yesterday morning. The public's emotional response is understandable," Dumbledore replied with gentle patience. "But emotion, however sincere, cannot be allowed to override the necessities of magical protection. Harry's placement with his aunt was not merely a matter of convenience, Cornelius. It was a matter of survival." "You keep saying that," Fudge said desperately, "but Amelia Bones is demanding details, and Arthur Weasley has legal authority, and that McGonagall woman is backing his version of events. What exactly am I supposed to tell them about these protections that apparently required child abuse? Dumbledore set down his teacup with the deliberate care of a man choosing his words very precisely. The protection I speak of is based on ancient blood magic, Cornelius. When Lily Potter died to save her son, her sacrifice created a powerful ward that shields Harry from Voldemort and his followers. But this protection only functions while Harry can call his mother's blood, relative's house, his home. And why? Fudge asked, with growing frustration. Does that protection require the boy to be locked in a cupboard? It does not, Dumbledore admitted quietly. The protection requires only that he reside with his aunt's family and consider their house his home. The unfortunate conditions of his upbringing were not necessary for the magic to function. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Fudge stared at Dumbledore with the slow horror of a politician, realizing he had been defending the indefensible. You mean to tell me, Fudge said slowly, that you knew the boy was being abused, and the protection would have worked just as well if he had been treated properly? I believed that some degree of hardship would strengthen Harry's character, Dumbledore said carefully. I believed that facing adversity would prepare him for the challenges that lay ahead. You believed, Fudge interrupted, with uncharacteristic sharpness, that a child should suffer because it would be good for him. Albus, do you have any idea what this is going to do to my administration when the full investigation comes out? Meanwhile, 15 miles away at the Burrow, Arthur Weasley was discovering that Albus Dumbledore's political influence, while considerable, was not the same thing as legal authority. According to the Department of Magical Children's Services records, Arthur said to Bill, who was helping him sort through stacks of official documents, no formal guardianship papers were ever filed for Harry Potter after his parents' death. Dumbledore had temporary emergency authority to place the child, but that authority expired after 30 days, unless renewed through proper channels. Bill looked up from the legal text he was reading. And was it renewed? No. Which means that for the past 10 years and 11 months, Harry Potter has been living with people who had no legal right to custody, under the supervision of a man who had no legal authority to place him there. Arthur's voice was grim. Dumbledore has been operating entirely outside the law. Dad, Bill said slowly, this is bigger than child abuse. This is kidnapping. Arthur sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of that realization settle over him. I think we need to have a family meeting. An hour later, the entire Weasley family was gathered around the kitchen table, with Harry sitting between Molly and Ron, looking confused and increasingly worried as the conversation grew more serious. What I'm about to tell you, Arthur began carefully, is going to be upsetting. But Harry, you have the right to know the truth about your situation, and we have the responsibility to make sure you understand what's been done to you. Harry nodded uncertainly, and Arthur noticed that Molly's hand had moved to rest protectively on the boy's shoulder. When your parents died, Professor Dumbledore had emergency authority to place you with guardians. But that authority was temporary. It was supposed to be formalized through proper legal channels within 30 days. That never happened. According to ministry records, no one has had legal custody of you for almost 11 years. What does that mean? Harry asked quietly. It means, Bill said gently, that the Dursleys had no legal right to keep you, and Dumbledore had no legal authority to leave you with them. It means your entire childhood has been based on decisions that violated wizarding law. Harry stared at Bill. So I could have been removed from the Dursleys at any time, for 11 years. Yes, Arthur confirmed. If anyone had checked the records, if anyone had filed the proper paperwork, if anyone had conducted a single follow-up visit, yes, you could have been removed and placed with a proper family years ago. The kitchen was very quiet. Harry was looking down at his hands, and Arthur could see the moment when the full implications hit him. They knew, Harry said softly. Professor Dumbledore knew I was being hurt, and he knew it wasn't legal, and he left me there anyway." "Yes," Molly said firmly. "And that is not your fault, Harry. None of it is your fault." Harry looked up, and Arthur was shocked to see anger in those green eyes, not the confused hurt he had expected, but genuine, blazing anger. "Why?" Harry demanded. "Why would he do that to me? What did I ever do to deserve that?" Before anyone could answer, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Arthur exchanged glances with Molly. They weren't expecting visitors, and moved to answer it. Albus Dumbledore stood on the doorstep, looking older and more tired than Arthur had ever seen him. His usual twinkling demeanor was notably absent. "Arthur," he said quietly, "I believe we need to speak." "Professor," Arthur replied with cool politeness, "you're welcome to come in, but I should warn you that Harry is present, and he's just learned some very disturbing information about his legal status." Dumbledore stepped into the kitchen and surveyed the assembled family with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Harry," he said gently, "I can see that you are upset, and I understand why. But there are things about your situation that are far more complex than they may appear." "Complex?" Harry stood up, his anger clearly growing. "What's complex about locking a child in a cupboard? What's complex about lying to me about my parents? What's complex about leaving me with people who hate me when you could have taken me away at any time?" "Harry, my dear boy," Dumbledore began. But Harry cut him off. "I'm not your dear boy," Harry said fiercely. "You don't get to call me that when you let them hurt me for 11 years. You don't get to pretend you care about me when you chose to leave me there." "I chose to leave you there," Dumbledore said quietly, "because there are forces in this world that would destroy you if they could find you. The protection your mother's sacrifice gave you would have worked just as well if I'd been treated properly," Arthur interrupted. "We've already discussed this with the minister, Professor. The blood protection required residence with Petunia Dursley, not abuse by her." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. "That is accurate," he admitted finally. "Then why?" Molly demanded, and her voice carried a mother's fury that made the kitchen itself seem to vibrate with protective magic. "If the protection would have worked either way, why did you leave him with people who would hurt him?" "Because," Dumbledore said with obvious reluctance, "I believed that some degree of hardship would prepare Harry for what lies ahead. I believed that facing adversity would strengthen his character and his resolve. I believed—" "You believed," Bill interrupted sharply, "that torturing a child would make him a better weapon." The silence that followed was deafening. Dumbledore looked around the room, taking in the expressions of horror and anger on every face, and seemed to realize that his justification had only made things worse. "There is a prophecy," he said quietly. "A prophecy made before Harry's birth, which speaks of his role in defeating the dark wizard who killed his parents. Harry was marked by Voldemort as his equal, and neither can live while the other survives." Harry went very still. "A prophecy about me?" "Yes. And I believed, wrongly I now see, that preparing you to face that destiny required hardening you to the realities of suffering and loss." "You used a prophecy," Molly said, with deadly calm, "to justify child abuse." "Mum," Harry said quietly, and everyone turned to look at him. He was standing very straight, and his anger had crystallized into something cold and determined. "I want him to leave." "Harry," Dumbledore began. "No," Harry said firmly. "I want you to leave. I don't want to hear about prophecies or destinies or greater goods. I want you to go away and leave me alone with my family." The emphasis on the word family was unmistakable, and Arthur felt a surge of fierce pride at the boy's courage. "Harry," Dumbledore said with what appeared to be genuine pain, "I understand that you are angry, and you have every right to be. But there are still dangers." "Then we'll face them," Ron said fiercely, standing up beside his friend. "All of us. Together." "As a family," Ginny added quietly from her place at the table. "That's right," Fred said. Absolutely right, George agreed. Percy, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, stood up as well. Professor Dumbledore, he said, with the formal precision that came naturally to him, I believe you should leave. This family has made it clear that they intend to protect Harry according to legal standards rather than your personal philosophy. Dumbledore looked around the room one more time, taking in the united front of the Weasley family standing behind Harry Potter. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of defeat. Very well, he said quietly. But Harry, please understand, everything I did because I believed it was necessary to keep you alive. Keeping me alive isn't the same as letting me live, Harry replied, and I'm done letting other people make that choice for me. After Dumbledore left, the family remained gathered around the kitchen table, the weight of what they had committed to settling over them like a heavy blanket. Bill, Arthur said quietly, I'd like you to examine Harry for any magical monitoring or tracking spells that might have been placed on him without consent. Already on it, Dad, Bill replied, pulling out his wand. This might feel a bit strange, Harry, but I need to check for any magical signatures that don't belong to you. The diagnostic spells revealed more than any of them had expected. Tracking charms, monitoring enchantments, even subtle compulsion spells designed to make Harry more compliant and less likely to question authority. How long have these been on me? Harry asked, watching Bill methodically dispel each unauthorized piece of magic. Based on the magical signatures, they were placed when you were very young, probably within the first few months after your parents' death. Harry was quiet for a long time after Bill finished his work, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady and resolved. I want to fight for legal custody, he said. I want to make sure that no one ever has the right to make decisions about my life without my permission again. And I want to make sure this doesn't happen to any other children. Arthur looked around the table at his family, his wife and children, and the boy they had chosen to protect, and saw nothing but determined agreement. Then that's what we'll do, he said simply. Whatever it takes. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, but inside the Burrow, Harry Potter was surrounded by people who would fight for his right to live as well as survive, and for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. Chapter 6. The Custody Hearing. Harry had never seen anything like the Wizengamot chambers. The vast circular room seemed to stretch impossibly high above him, with tiered benches rising in concentric circles around a central floor, where a single chair sat beneath a pool of golden light. Everything was carved from ancient stone that hummed with centuries of magical authority, and the weight of all that history made Harry feel very small indeed. It's quite something, isn't it? Arthur murmured beside him, as they were escorted to the witness gallery by a stern-faced court official. The Wizengamot has been meeting in this chamber for over 800 years. Harry nodded mutely, trying to process the fact that in a few minutes he would be testifying before the highest magical court in Britain about whether he wanted to remain with the Weasley family or return to the Dursleys. The sheer impossibility of the situation, that 11-year-old Harry Potter was the subject of a formal custody hearing involving some of the most powerful people in the wizarding world, had not quite sunk in yet. Molly squeezed his hand gently. Remember, sweetheart, just tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask of you. The gallery began to fill with witches and wizards in formal robes, their voices creating a low murmur that echoed off the stone walls. Harry recognized a few faces from the newspapers Bill had shown him. Minister Fudge, several department heads, what looked like reporters from the Daily Prophet. Everyone seemed to be stealing glances at him, and Harry fought the urge to sink lower in his seat. All rise for Chief Warlock Albus Dumbledore, called the court official, and the entire chamber fell silent as Dumbledore entered, wearing formal purple robes, his expression grave and distant. He took his place at what appeared to be the head of the chamber, but Harry noticed that he was not presiding over the hearing. that honour belonged to a severe-looking witch with iron-grey hair who had introduced herself earlier as Madame Marchbanks, the Deputy Chief Warlock. "This emergency session of the Wizengamot is hereby convened," Madame Marchbanks announced, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "to hear the matter of Potter versus Dursley regarding the custody and guardianship of Harry James Potter, age 11, ward of the wizarding community." The formality of hearing his own name, read aloud in such an official setting, made Harry's stomach flutter with nervousness. This was really happening. People were really going to decide where he lived and who took care of him, and this time he was going to have a voice in that decision. The petitioners, Arthur and Molly Weasley, seek emergency custody of the minor child pending formal guardianship proceedings. The respondent, Albus Dumbledore, acting in his capacity as the child's current guardian, contests this petition. Mr. Potter, as the subject of these proceedings, will be heard regarding his own preferences. Madame Marchbanks consulted her notes. "Professor Dumbledore, as current guardian, you may present your testimony first." Dumbledore rose from his seat and moved to the centre of the chamber, and Harry was struck by how different he looked in this setting. Not the kindly grandfather figure who had appeared at the Burrow, but a powerful wizard defending his actions before his peers. "Honoured members of the Wizengamot," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. The decision to place Harry Potter with his Muggle relatives was not made lightly, nor was it made without consideration for his welfare. The protection that shields young Harry from the followers of Voldemort, several people flinched at the name, is based on the ancient magic of his mother's sacrifice, which can only function while he resides with her blood relatives. "Professor," interrupted Madame Marchbanks, "the court has reviewed your previous statements regarding this protection. Is it your testimony that this magical protection requires the child to be mistreated by his relatives?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted finally. "The protection requires only that the child consider his aunt's house to be his home. The unfortunate circumstances of his upbringing were not necessary for the magic to function." A murmur ran through the gallery. Harry saw several Wizengamot members exchanging sharp looks. "Then why?" asked Madame Marchbanks with dangerous calm. "Were those circumstances permitted to continue for 11 years without intervention?" "Because I believed," Dumbledore said with obvious reluctance, "that facing hardship would prepare Harry for the challenges that await him. There is a prophecy." "Professor," Madame Marchbanks cut him off, "the existence of prophecies does not alter wizarding law regarding child protection. Are you testifying that you knowingly allowed a magical child to be abused because you believed it would benefit his character?" "I believed it would strengthen him for what lies ahead." The silence that followed was damning. Harry watched as member after member of the Wizengamot wrote notes with increasingly grave expressions. "Mr. Weasley," Madame Marchbanks called, "please present your petition." Arthur stood and moved to the centre of the chamber, carrying a thick folder of documentation. "Honoured members, my wife and I formally petition for emergency custody of Harry Potter based on documented evidence of severe neglect and abuse by his current guardians, the Dursley family. We further request that formal guardianship proceedings be initiated to determine permanent custody arrangements." Arthur opened his folder and began presenting the evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years navigating ministry bureaucracy. The photographs of Harry's cupboard, the medical documentation of his injuries and malnutrition, the testimony of neighbours who had witnessed the Dursleys' treatment of him. All of it was laid out with devastating clarity. "The child was housed in a cupboard under the stairs," Arthur said, his voice carrying throughout the silent chamber. "He was systematically starved, physically abused, and denied any knowledge of his magical heritage or his parents' true fate. He was told they died as worthless drunks in a car crash. He was made to believe that he was a burden and a freak." Harry could hear people in the gallery making shocked sounds, and several Wizengamot members were staring at Dumbledore with obvious horror. "My Lord Weasley," said one of the members, What is your professional assessment of the child's current condition? He is physically recovering well under my wife's care, Arthur replied. Emotionally, he is remarkably resilient, but the psychological damage from 11 years of systematic abuse will require time and patience to heal. Most importantly, he has expressed a clear preference regarding his future guardianship. And that preference is? He wishes to remain with my family, where he has experienced safety and unconditional love for the first time in his life. Madam Marchbanks nodded. Mr. Potter, would you please join us? Harry's legs felt unsteady as he walked to the center of the chamber, acutely aware of dozens of eyes watching his every movement. The chair provided for witnesses was adult-sized, and Harry felt even smaller sitting in it under the bright, magical light. Mr. Potter, Madam Marchbanks said gently, this is your opportunity to tell the Wizengamot what you want for your future. Take your time, and remember that no one here wishes you any harm. Harry looked up at the tiered seats surrounding him, taking in all the serious faces watching him with varying degrees of sympathy and concern. These people had power, real power to change his life. And for once, they were asking what he wanted. I want to stay with the Weasley family, he said clearly, his voice carrying further than he had expected. They've been kind to me. They've treated me like I actually matter. They've never hit me or locked me up or told me I was worthless. Mr. Potter, said another Wizengamot member, are you aware that you have significant inheritance rights as the sole heir of the Potter family? Harry blinked. I have what? You are entitled to the Potter family vault at Gringotts, which contains a considerable fortune, as well as any properties or investments your parents may have left you. As your guardian, Professor Dumbledore has had control of these assets during your minority. Harry turned to stare at Dumbledore, who was pointedly not meeting his eyes. I have money. My parents left me money. Indeed, quite a substantial amount, according to Gringotts records. Harry felt a familiar anger beginning to burn in his chest. And the Dursleys didn't know about this? No, Mr. Potter. Only Professor Dumbledore had access to information about your inheritance. So while Harry had been dressed in Dudley's cast-offs and told the family couldn't afford to properly feed him, he had actually had a fortune sitting in a vault that Dumbledore controlled. Harry looked up at the man who had shaped every aspect of his life without his knowledge or consent, and felt his anger crystallize into something cold and determined. Professor Dumbledore, he said loudly enough for the entire chamber to hear, did you ever plan to tell me about my parents' money? Harry, Dumbledore said softly, I believed it was important for you to develop without the corrupting influence of wealth. I wanted you to understand the value of hard work and humility. By making me think I was a charity case? Harry demanded. By letting the Dursleys tell me I was expensive to keep, and they were doing me a favor by not throwing me out on the street. The chamber was completely silent now, and Harry could feel the collective shock and disapproval directed at Dumbledore. Mr. William Weasley, Madam Marchbanks called, please present your testimony regarding the magical examinations. Bill stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to presenting technical information to authorities. Honored members, I conducted a comprehensive scan of Mr. Potter for unauthorized magical enchantments. I found multiple tracking charms, monitoring spells, and compulsion enchantments that had been placed without his knowledge or consent. Compulsion enchantments? Madam Marchbanks asked sharply. Subtle ones, designed to make him more compliant and less likely to question authority figures. They appeared to have been placed when he was very young, probably as an infant. Harry felt sick. Even his own thoughts and feelings had been manipulated without his knowledge. Professor McGonagall, Madam Marchbanks called next. You were present when Mr. Potter was placed with the Dursley family. What is your testimony? McGonagall stood with the rigid posture of someone delivering an unpleasant duty. I observed the Dursley family for a full day before Mr. Potter's placement, and I strongly advised Professor Dumbledore against leaving a magical child in their care. They displayed contempt for magic and magical people, treated their own child with excessive indulgence while showing no capacity for nurturing, and demonstrated the sort of narrow-minded prejudice that would inevitably lead to the mistreatment of any child who was different from their expectations. And what was Professor Dumbledore's response to your concerns? He assured me that they would grow to love Harry as their own, and that the placement was necessary for his protection. I now deeply regret that I did not pursue the matter further through official channels. The next witness called was someone Harry had never expected to see, a man with black hair and dark eyes who moved to the witness chair with obvious reluctance. "Professor Snape," Madam Marchbanks said, "you were a close friend of Lily Potter. In your opinion, would she have approved of her son's placement with the Dursley family?" Snape was quiet for such a long time that Harry wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Lily Evans Potter despised her sister's narrow-minded prejudices and cruel treatment of anyone she considered abnormal. She would have been horrified by the idea of her son being raised by people who would punish him for possessing the magical gifts she treasured. She would never have forgiven anyone who knowingly subjected her child to such treatment. And what do you believe she would have wanted for her son? "She would have wanted him to be loved," Snape said simply. "She would have wanted him to be safe and happy and proud of who he was. She would have wanted him to grow up knowing that he was wanted and valued." Harry felt tears burning his eyes. This man, who seemed so cold and stern, had known his mother and was speaking about what she would have wanted for him. "Professor Dumbledore," Madam Marchbanks said, "you have mentioned a prophecy several times. The court requires full disclosure of any prophecy relating to Mr. Potter's situation." Dumbledore stood slowly, looking older than Harry had ever seen him. "The prophecy states that a child born as the 7th month dies would have the power to defeat the Dark Lord, that the Dark Lord would mark him as his equal, and that neither can live while the other survives. It identifies Harry as that child." The chamber erupted in shocked whispers. Harry felt the blood drain from his face as the full weight of those words hit him. "You mean," he said quietly, "that either I have to kill Voldemort, or he'll kill me?" "That is the prophecy's implication, yes." Harry stared at Dumbledore, struggling to process this information. "And you thought the best way to prepare me for that was to let people hurt me for 11 years. I believed that hardship would make you strong enough to face your destiny with courage." "I see." Harry stood up in the witness chair, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber. "Professor Dumbledore, I don't care about prophecies or destinies, or your beliefs about what would make me strong. I care about having a family that loves me and wants me to be happy. I care about going to school and learning magic and maybe having friends. I care about living, not just surviving." He turned to face the Wizengamot directly. "The Weasley family has given me more love and safety in 1 week than the Dursleys gave me in 11 years. If I have to face Voldemort someday, I'd rather do it knowing that there are people who actually care whether I live or die, not people who see me as a weapon to be sharpened through suffering." The chamber was completely silent. Harry sat back down, his heart pounding, and waited for the Wizengamot to decide his fate. "The Wizengamot will now deliberate," Madam Marchbanks announced. The deliberation took less than 10 minutes. "By unanimous vote," Madam Marchbanks declared when they reconvened, "emergency custody of Harry James Potter is hereby granted to Arthur and Molly Weasley, pending formal guardianship proceedings. Professor Dumbledore's authority over Mr. Potter's person and property is hereby terminated, and control of the Potter inheritance shall be transferred to Gringotts Wizarding Bank, pending Mr. Potter's majority." Harry felt as though he might faint with relief. It was over. He was free. "Furthermore," Madam Marchbanks continued, "this court hereby orders a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding Mr. Potter's placement and the failure of ministry oversight protocols that allowed this situation to continue undetected." As the chamber began to empty, Harry found himself surrounded by the Weasley family, all of them talking at once and hugging him, and generally behaving as though he had just accomplished something heroic rather than simply asking to be treated with basic human kindness. "Well," Arthur said with obvious satisfaction, "I think that went rather well." Harry laughed, actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in his life. He was free, he had a family, and for the first time since he had learned about the prophecy, he felt like he might actually have a future worth living. Outside the ministry, the summer sun was shining, and Harry Potter was finally, officially, home. Chapter 7. New Beginnings. Harry woke up in Ron's bedroom to the sound of Molly calling all her children for breakfast, and for a moment he simply lay still, savouring the impossible reality of being wanted somewhere. It had been 3 weeks since the Wizengamot hearing, 3 weeks of living at the Burrow as an official member of the family, and he still couldn't quite believe it was real. "Come on, Harry," Ron said, already pulling on his jumper. "If we're late, Mum will give us the lecture about family meals being important for family bonding, and Percy will nod along like it's the most profound wisdom ever spoken." Harry grinned, rolling out of bed and reaching for the clothes that Molly had bought him. Clothes that actually fit. Clothes that were his own rather than Dudley's cast-offs. "I don't mind the lectures," he admitted. "I like that someone cares enough to give them." Ron paused in the middle of lacing his trainers, glancing at Harry with that careful look he still got sometimes, when Harry said things that reminded everyone just how different his childhood had been. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I suppose they are pretty nice, aren't they?" Downstairs, the kitchen was in its usual state of controlled chaos. Molly was stirring porridge while simultaneously packing sandwiches for their trip to Diagon Alley. Percy was reading the Daily Prophet aloud to no one in particular, and Fred and George were whispering over what appeared to be a piece of parchment covered in diagrams that definitely didn't look like homework. "Good morning, Harry dear," Molly said warmly, pressing a kiss to the top of his head as he sat down at the table. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," Harry replied, still marveling at having someone ask about his sleep, his comfort, his well-being. 3 weeks in, and he wasn't sure he would ever take it for granted. "Excellent. Eat up then. We've got quite a busy day ahead of us. Diagon Alley for your school things, and then I thought we might stop by Quality Quidditch Supplies. Ron's been dying to show you a proper broomstick display." "Mum," Ron said excitedly, "can we really? Harry's never seen racing brooms up close, and the new Nimbus 2000s are supposed to be—" "We'll see," Molly said, with the sort of indulgent tone that suggested the answer was probably yes. "But school supplies first. Books, cauldrons, robes that actually fit properly." Arthur appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for the day despite the early hour. "Morning, everyone. Harry, looking forward to your first proper trip to Diagon Alley?" "Very much," Harry said, and meant it. His previous visit with Hagrid had been wonderful, but overwhelming. Everything had been new and strange, and he'd been too shocked by learning about magic to really appreciate what he was seeing. Now, going as part of the Weasley family, with time to explore and people to share the experience with, felt like an entirely different proposition. "Right then," Arthur said, consulting his pocket watch. "We'll take the Flu network, much faster than Muggle transport, and Harry needs to learn to use it anyway." An hour later, Harry was stumbling out of a fireplace in the leaky cauldron, covered in soot but grinning with the sheer exhilaration of magical travel. Ron emerged behind him with practiced ease, followed by the twins, Percy, and finally Molly and Arthur with Ginny between them. "First time is always a bit rough," Percy said kindly, offering Harry a handkerchief. "You'll get the hang of it." "It's brilliant," Harry said, brushing soot off his robes. "Does it always feel like flying?" "Only when you do it wrong," Fred said with a grin. "Which is the best way to do it," George added. "Fred, George," Molly warned, but she was smiling. "Don't give Harry any ideas about doing magic wrong on purpose." The walk through Diagon Alley was a revelation. With the Weasley family surrounding him, Harry could actually enjoy the magical atmosphere instead of feeling lost and overwhelmed. Ron kept up a running commentary on everything they passed. Percy provided historical context for the more interesting shops, and the twins pointed out which establishments sold the best joke items and which ones to avoid, because they were dead boring. "First stop, Gringotts," Arthur announced. "Harry needs access to his vault, and we should probably discuss his financial situation properly." The trip to Gringotts was an education in more ways than one. Harry had known, intellectually, that he had inherited money from his parents, but seeing the actual contents of his vault, piles of gold galleons, silver sickles, and bronze knuts stretching back into the shadowy depths, made the reality of his wealth sink in for the first time. "This is all mine?" he asked quietly, staring at more money than he had ever imagined existing. "Every bit of it," Arthur confirmed. "Your parents worked hard to build their fortune, and they wanted you to have it. Dumbledore never had any right to keep this information from you." Harry filled his money bag with more coins than he had ever held at one time, but what struck him most was the way the Weasley family treated his newfound wealth, with matter-of-fact acceptance rather than awkwardness or resentment. They were genuinely pleased for him, without a hint of jealousy or expectation. "Right," Molly said as they emerged from the bank. "School supplies. We'll need to get everyone's books and equipment, and Harry will need a complete set of robes and supplies." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. At Madame Malkin's, Harry was fitted for proper school robes, dress robes, and everyday wear, with Molly fussing over the measurements and insisting that everything be of the highest quality. "None of that second-hand nonsense for your first year," she declared firmly. "You deserve robes that fit properly." In Flourish and Blots, Percy took charge of helping Harry select his textbooks, patiently explaining the purpose of each subject and offering study tips based on his own experience at Hogwarts. "Transfiguration is probably the most challenging subject for first years," Percy said seriously as they browsed the shelves. "Professor McGonagall is strict but fair, and if you put in the effort, you'll do well. Potions can be tricky. Professor Snape has a reputation for being rather harsh with students who don't take the subject seriously." "What's he like?" Harry asked, remembering the stern man who had testified about his mother at the custody hearing. "Intimidating," Percy admitted, "but knowledgeable. If you show genuine interest and effort, he'll respect that. Just don't expect him to be warm and fuzzy about it." At the apothecary, Molly insisted on purchasing the highest quality ingredients for Harry's potions kit, despite his protests that the basic set would be fine. "Nonsense," she said firmly. "Proper ingredients make all the difference in potions work, and I won't have you starting at a disadvantage because we tried to save a few galleons." The twins, meanwhile, had appointed themselves Harry's guides to the more interesting aspects of Diagon Alley. While the adults were focused on practical necessities, Fred and George showed him the hidden passages between shops, pointed out which vendors sold the best sweets, and explained the finer points of magical joke items. "This," said Fred, holding up a small wrapped sweet, "is a Tun-Tung toffee. Still in development, but we're getting close to perfection." "What does it do?" Harry asked. "Makes your tongue grow to about 4 feet long," George explained cheerfully. "Completely harmless. Wears off in a few minutes, but very effective for getting revenge on people who deserve it." "Like Dudley Dursley," Fred added with a wicked grin. Harry laughed, feeling a warm glow of belonging at being included in their schemes. "You two are going to get me in trouble before I even start school." "That's the idea," they said in unison. Even Ginny, who had been shy around Harry for the first week after his arrival, was beginning to warm up to him. She walked beside him as they moved between shops, offering her own observations about the magical world with the sort of insider knowledge that came from growing up in it. "The ice cream at Fortescue's is the best in London," she said quietly as they passed the shop. "And if you're ever feeling homesick at Hogwarts, an owl to Mum always helps. She sends the best care packages." "Thank you," Harry said seriously. "I'll remember that." Their peaceful shopping expedition was interrupted as they were leaving Ollivander's wand shop. Harry, now the proud owner of an 11-inch holly and phoenix feather wand that had chosen him with a shower of warm golden sparks. A group of witches and wizards had gathered on the street, and Harry could hear his name being mentioned in urgent whispers. "That's him," one of them was saying. "Harry Potter, the boy who lived." "Poor child," said another. "To think what he's been through." "Is it true what the papers said about Dumbledore knowing he was being abused?" Molly's expression hardened immediately, and she moved closer to Harry with the sort of protective instinct that reminded everyone why you didn't want to cross a mother defending her children. "Perhaps," she said loudly enough for the entire group to hear, "you could save your gossip for when the child isn't standing right here." The group had the grace to look ashamed, but one witch stepped forward with the determined air of someone with an important opinion to share. "Mrs. Weasley, surely you understand the public's concern for Harry's welfare. We only want to know that he's being properly cared for after such a terrible ordeal." "He's being cared for by people who love him," Molly replied with dangerous calm. "People who want him to be happy and healthy and allowed to grow up in peace. If you're genuinely concerned about his welfare, the best thing you can do is let him have a normal childhood without treating him like a celebrity or a curiosity." The witch looked as though she wanted to argue, but one look at Molly's face convinced her otherwise. The group dispersed quickly, leaving the Weasley family to continue their shopping in peace. "I'm sorry about that, Harry," Arthur said quietly. "I'm afraid your newfound freedom has made you even more of a public figure than before." "It's all right," Harry said, though he was grateful for the way the entire family had closed ranks around him without hesitation. "I'm getting used to it." "You shouldn't have to get used to it," Ron said fiercely. "You're just Harry. People should leave you alone." Harry felt that warm glow of belonging again. In the wizarding world, he might be the boy who lived, but to the Weasleys, he was just Harry, their Harry, and they would protect his right to be normal with the same fierce determination they brought to everything else. The rest of their shopping trip passed without incident. They visited Quality Quidditch Supplies, where Ron's enthusiasm for the sport proved infectious, and Harry found himself genuinely excited about learning to fly. They stopped for ice cream at Fortescue's, where Harry experienced the simple pleasure of sitting around a table with people who enjoyed his company and wanted him to be happy. As the afternoon wore on and their packages accumulated, Harry realized that this was what normal felt like. This was what it was like to be part of a family that worked together, looked out for each other, and found joy in sharing experiences. This was what he had been missing for 11 years without even knowing it existed. "Ready to go home?" Molly asked, as the sun began to set over Diagon Alley. Home. Harry tested the word in his mind and found it fit perfectly. "Yes," he said, gathering his packages and following his family back toward the leaky cauldron. "I'm ready to go home." That night, as Harry sat in Ron's room, sorting through his new school things with the help of his soon-to-be roommate, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. He had a family who loved him, friends who included him, adults who protected him, and a future that stretched ahead full of possibility rather than dread. "Nervous about Hogwarts?" Ron asked, noticing Harry's thoughtful expression. "A little," Harry admitted, "but mostly excited. I feel like everything's finally starting." Ron grinned. "Yeah, it's going to be brilliant having you there. We're going to have the best time." Harry smiled back, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever the prophecy meant for his future, he would face them with people who cared about him beside him. And that made all the difference in the world. Chapter 8. Hogwarts Under Scrutiny. Platform 9 3/4 was exactly as magical as Ron had promised it would be, but what Harry hadn't expected was how different it would feel to be there with a family who actually wanted him to succeed. Instead of stumbling through the barrier alone and confused, he walked through with confidence, flanked by Molly's fierce hugs and Arthur's practical advice, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of Weasley family departure rituals. "Remember to write," Molly said for the third time, straightening Harry's tie and checking that his trunk was properly secured. "Every week, mind you. I want to know how you're settling in, how your classes are going, if you're making friends." "Mum," Ron said with fond exasperation, "he's going to write, and he's going to be fine. We're going to look after each other." "I know, dear," Molly replied, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she pulled both boys into another fierce hug. "My babies, going off to Hogwarts together." Harry submitted to the embrace with a warmth in his chest that still felt new and precious. Someone was going to miss him. Someone was going to worry about him and wait for his letters and care whether he was happy. The simple reality of it was still overwhelming. "Take care of each other," Arthur said seriously, shaking both boys' hands with formal gravity. "And Harry, remember that you have choices now. You don't have to accept anything that doesn't feel right." The train journey was everything Harry had hoped it would be. He sat in a compartment with Ron, watching the countryside roll by, sharing chocolate frogs and discussing what they were most excited about learning. There was no awkwardness, no careful getting-to-know-you conversation. They were already friends, already family, and the easy companionship that had developed over the summer made the journey feel like an adventure rather than a leap into the unknown. "Think you'll be in Gryffindor?" Ron asked, as they changed into their school robes, the castle finally visible in the distance. Harry considered this. A month ago, he wouldn't have known what that question meant. Now, after weeks of Percy's patient tutoring and the twins' enthusiastic storytelling, he understood the significance of the houses and their different values. "I hope so," he said honestly. "I'd like to be brave enough for Gryffindor. But I suppose the Sorting Hat will know better than I do." "Dad says the hat takes your preferences into account," Ron said encouragingly. "And you're definitely brave enough, standing up to the Wizengamot like you did." "That was brilliant." The Great Hall took Harry's breath away. Even with Ron's detailed descriptions and Percy's historical commentary, nothing had prepared him for the reality of the enchanted ceiling, the floating candles, the 4 long tables filled with students who all seemed to know exactly where they belonged. But instead of feeling lost and overwhelmed, Harry felt excited. This was going to be his school, his home for most of the year, and he was here with people who cared about him. Professor McGonagall led the first years forward for the sorting, and Harry noticed that she caught his eye with a small, reassuring nod. After her testimony at the custody hearing, she had become something of an ally in Harry's mind, someone who had advocated for his welfare when it mattered. The Sorting Hat's song was entertaining, but Harry found himself paying more attention to the faces at the Gryffindor table, picking out Percy's serious expression and the twins' encouraging grins. When his name was called, he walked to the stool with steady steps, no longer the uncertain boy who had once believed he deserved nothing better than a cupboard under the stairs. The hat settled over his head, and Harry heard its voice clearly in his mind. "Well, well, Harry Potter, you've had quite a journey to get here, haven't you? And with a family who loves you now, I see. Excellent. That changes everything." "Does it?" Harry thought back. "Oh, yes. Courage is much easier to find when you have something worth protecting, something worth returning to. You could do well in any house, young Potter, but I think, yes, you'll do best where you can learn to be the protector rather than just the protected. Gryffindor!" The Gryffindor table erupted in cheers, and Harry felt a surge of pure joy as he made his way to sit beside Percy, accepting congratulations and backslaps from students who seemed genuinely pleased to welcome him to their house. When Ron joined him 20 minutes later, grinning with relief and excitement, Harry felt the last of his first-day nerves disappear. Whatever Hogwarts brought, he would face it with his best friend beside him and a loving family waiting for his letters home. Dumbledore's welcome speech was notably different from what Percy had described from previous years. The headmaster looked older and more subdued than Harry remembered, and his usual twinkling demeanor was notably absent, as he addressed the assembled students. "Welcome to Hogwarts," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying clearly through the Great Hall. "As we begin another year of magical education, I must address some recent changes to our school's oversight and policies. The Ministry of Magic has instituted new safeguarding protocols to ensure the welfare of all our students, and we welcome their guidance in creating the safest possible environment for learning." Harry exchanged glances with Ron. This was clearly about the investigation into Harry's situation and Dumbledore's role in it. "Additionally," Dumbledore continued, "I want to emphasize that every student at Hogwarts has the right to feel safe, supported, and valued. If any student has concerns about their welfare or treatment, they should feel free to speak with their head of house, myself, or the new student advocacy liaisons who will be visiting regularly throughout the year." The speech was shorter than usual, and notably lacked Dumbledore's typical warmth and humor. When he sat down, the hall buzzed with speculation about what exactly had prompted these changes. "Student advocacy liaisons?" Percy murmured to Harry. "That's new. I wonder what brought that on." Harry had a pretty good idea. Over the following weeks, Harry discovered that Hogwarts was indeed under unusual scrutiny. Ministry officials appeared regularly, observing classes and interviewing students about their experiences. Professor McGonagall seemed to be keeping a particularly close eye on the Gryffindor first years, checking in with them individually about their adjustment and making sure they understood all the support resources available to them. "Potter," she said, after his first Transfiguration class. "Might I have a word?" Harry approached her desk with curiosity, rather than apprehension. Another change from what his life might have been. "How are you settling in?" she asked, her stern expression softening slightly. "I know this represents quite a significant change from your summer circumstances." "Very well, Professor," Harry replied honestly. "Everyone's been really kind, and the classes are fascinating. I'm grateful to be here." "Good." McGonagall nodded approvingly. "I want you to know that my door is always open if you need anything. Academic support, personal guidance, or simply someone to talk to. Given everything you've been through, it's important that you know you have advocates here." "Thank you, Professor. That means a great deal." Professor Snape's behavior was more complex and harder to interpret. Harry had expected hostility based on Percy's warnings, but instead found himself the recipient of a watchful attention that seemed more protective than antagonistic. Snape was still intimidating and sharp-tongued with students who weren't paying attention, but Harry noticed that he never seemed to target Harry specifically for criticism. After a particularly challenging potions lesson involving a simple healing draft, Snape kept Harry after class. "Potter," he said quietly, "your mother had a particular talent for potions. She understood instinctively that the art requires patience and precision rather than flashy displays of magical power." Harry looked up at him uncertainly. "Sir?" "You have her hands," Snape continued, studying Harry's careful preparation technique. "Steady, methodical. If you apply yourself seriously to this subject, you may find you have inherited more than just her eyes." It was the closest thing to encouragement Harry had ever received from the intimidating potions master, and he treasured it accordingly. "Thank you, sir. I'll work hard." Snape nodded curtly and dismissed him, but Harry caught something that might have been approval in those dark eyes. 2 weeks into term, Harry was settling into his evening routine of homework and letter writing when Ron flopped down beside him in the common room, looking unusually serious. "Harry, have you noticed that Dumbledore keeps trying to talk to you?" Harry looked up from the letter he was writing to Molly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he keeps showing up when you're around, in the corridors, at meals, after classes, and he always looks like he wants to say something, but then he doesn't." Now that Ron mentioned it, Harry had noticed the headmaster's increased presence in his vicinity. Dumbledore seemed to be making an effort to cross paths with Harry, offering gentle smiles and inquiring about his adjustment, but there was an awkwardness to the interactions that suggested deeper conversations being carefully avoided. "I think he's trying to rebuild his relationship with me," Harry said slowly, "after everything that happened this summer." "Are you going to let him?" Harry considered this. "I don't know. I'm not angry anymore. Not really. But I don't trust him the way I might have before I knew what he was capable of. And I don't want to go back to letting adults make decisions about my life without including me." "Fair enough," Ron said loyally. "You don't owe him anything, you know. Not after what he put you through." Harry nodded and returned to his letter, describing his classes and professors to Molly with the sort of detail that came from knowing someone actually wanted to hear about every aspect of his day. Her response letters were warm and encouraging, full of pride in his accomplishments and reminders that the Burrow would always be his home. "Dear Harry," he wrote, "Potions continues to be challenging, but interesting. Professor Snape is intimidating, but I think he might actually want me to succeed, which is more than I expected. Ron and I are doing well in defense against the dark arts, and Professor Quirrell is enthusiastic if a bit nervous. I think you would like Professor McGonagall. She's strict but fair, and she's been keeping an eye on all the first years to make sure we're adjusting well. I'm making friends with some of the other Gryffindors too. There's a girl named Hermione Granger, who knows almost as much about magic as Percy does, despite being Muggle-born. She's very kind and offered to help me with History of Magic, which is taught by a ghost who makes even the most exciting historical events sound boring. I hope everyone at home is well. Please give my love to Dad and all my siblings, and tell them I miss them terribly. I can't wait for the Christmas holidays to share all my Hogwarts stories in person. All my love, Harry." As October arrived, and the autumn term settled into a comfortable routine, Harry realized that his worst fears about Hogwarts, that he would be alone, that he wouldn't fit in, that he would be found wanting somehow, had not materialized. Instead, he was thriving. His grades were excellent, his friendships were growing stronger, and most importantly, he felt secure in the knowledge that he was wanted and valued, both at school and at home. The Ministry Oversight Committee had completed their initial review and implemented several new policies, including regular student welfare checks and mandatory reporting procedures for any concerns about student safety or well-being. Dumbledore had accepted these changes with public grace, but Harry noticed that the headmaster seemed subdued, as if the weight of his failures was finally settling on his shoulders. "Mr. Potter," Dumbledore said one evening as Harry was leaving the library, "might I walk with you back to Gryffindor Tower?" Harry nodded politely. "Of course, Professor." They walked in silence for a few minutes before Dumbledore spoke again. "I hope you are finding Hogwarts to be everything you hoped it would be." "Yes, sir. I love it here." "I am very glad to hear that." Dumbledore paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Harry, I want you to know that I deeply regret the choices I made regarding your upbringing. I believed I was acting in your best interests, but I now understand that I was profoundly wrong." Harry looked at the old wizard, taking in the genuine regret in those blue eyes. "Thank you for saying that, Professor. Is there any possibility that we might begin again? I would very much like the opportunity to know you as you truly are, rather than as I believed you should be." Harry considered this carefully. "I think," he said finally, "that I would like that too, but it would have to be different this time. I need to be included in decisions about my life, and I need to know that my family's wishes will be respected." "Of course," Dumbledore agreed quickly. "You have my word that I will not presume to make choices for you again." "Then yes," Harry said with a small smile. "I think we could try starting over." As they reached the portrait of the fat lady, Harry reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few months. He was no longer the powerless boy who had been shuffled from one situation to another without consultation or consideration. He was Harry Potter, beloved son of the Weasley family, Gryffindor student, and someone with agency over his own future. It was, he thought, as he climbed through the portrait hole into the warm, welcoming atmosphere of the Gryffindor common room. Exactly the way life should be. Chapter 9. Tests and Growth. By the end of October, Harry Potter was no longer the uncertain boy who had stumbled through his first week at Hogwarts, trying to learn everything at once. His grades in Transfiguration were among the best in his year. His potions work had earned grudging approval from Professor Snape, and his confidence in both academic and social situations had grown considerably. Most importantly, he was learning to navigate challenges with the security of knowing he had people who believed in him. "Harry," Hermione Granger said one evening as they worked together in the library, "I don't think I've ever met anyone who asks such good questions in class." Harry looked up from his charms essay, surprised by the compliment. His friendship with Hermione had developed gradually over the autumn term, built on a shared love of learning and mutual respect rather than the dramatic bonding that Ron had warned him sometimes happened in crisis situations. "Thank you," he said with genuine warmth. "I suppose I'm making up for lost time. I didn't know magic existed until this summer, so everything is still fascinating to me." "That's what I like about studying with you," Hermione replied thoughtfully. "You approach everything with such genuine curiosity. Most wizard-born students take magic for granted, but you never do." It was exactly the sort of friendship Harry had hoped to find at Hogwarts, based on shared interests and complementary strengths, rather than his fame or circumstances. Hermione knew about his background, of course. Everyone at Hogwarts did. But she treated him as simply Harry, her study partner, who happened to have survived something terrible and found his way to something wonderful. Their peaceful study session was interrupted by Ron bursting into the library with uncharacteristic excitement. "Harry!" he whispered urgently, mindful of Madame Pince's watchful glare. "Wood wants to see you on the Quidditch pitch. Right now." Harry exchanged glances with Hermione, who nodded encouragingly. "Go on," she said with a smile. "I'll save your place." The conversation with Oliver Wood, Gryffindor's Quidditch captain, was both thrilling and terrifying. Harry had never flown competitively before. His experience was limited to the lessons with Madame Hooch and informal practice sessions with the twins during the summer. But Wood had apparently been watching him during flying lessons and liked what he saw. "Natural talent," Wood said enthusiastically, after watching Harry demonstrate his flying skills. "Instinctive understanding of three-dimensional movement. Potter, how would you feel about trying out for the team as Seeker?" The tryout itself was less nerve-wracking than it might have been, largely because Harry knew that whatever happened, he would still have a home and a family who cared about him. That security allowed him to focus on the pure joy of flying, rather than the pressure of needing to succeed. When Wood announced that Harry had made the team, his first thought was of sharing the news with the people who mattered most to him. The letter he sent home that evening was met with an enthusiastic response that arrived by return owl the following morning. "Dear Harry, we are so incredibly proud of you. Quidditch team in your first year. That's extraordinary. Your father would have been over the moon. Bill says to tell you that the youngest Seeker in a century is nothing to sneeze at. And Percy has been going around telling everyone who will listen about his academically accomplished brother, who also happens to be a Quidditch prodigy. We'll be there for your first match, of course. Wild hippogriffs couldn't keep us away. Arthur has already arranged time off work, and I'm planning to bring enough food for half the stadium. We love you so much, sweetheart, and we're so proud of everything you're accomplishing. All our love, Mum and Dad." The Halloween feast that year took on a different significance for Harry than it might have in another timeline. Instead of feeling alone or uncertain about his place at Hogwarts, he was surrounded by friends and housemates who had become genuinely important to him. When Professor Quirrell burst into the Great Hall shrieking about a troll in the dungeons, Harry's first instinct was to make sure his friends were safe rather than to seek out danger. "Hermione," he said urgently, as the hall erupted into chaos, "where were you going when you left the feast?" "The girls' bathroom on the second floor," she replied, her face pale with understanding. "Oh no! What if the troll—" "We're going to find her," Ron said immediately, and Harry felt a surge of gratitude for his friend's instant loyalty. "Together," Harry added firmly. "We stick together, and we get help if we need it." Their encounter with the mountain troll was brief and terrifying, but it ended differently than it might have in another world. Instead of 3 first years taking on a 12-foot monster alone, Harry sent Ron to get McGonagall, while he and Hermione focused on keeping the troll contained until adult help arrived. "Teamwork," McGonagall said approvingly after the situation had been resolved and the troll removed. "Good thinking, all of you. 5 points each to Gryffindor for keeping your heads in a crisis." Later, as they sat in the common room recovering from their adventure, Hermione looked at both boys with obvious emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming to find me, and for thinking to get help instead of trying to handle everything yourselves." "That's what friends do," Harry said simply, and meant it completely. His first Quidditch match in November was a revelation in more ways than one. Not only did he discover that he had inherited his father's natural talent for the sport, but he also experienced the incredible joy of having his entire family in the stands, cheering for him. The Weasley cheering section was impossible to miss. Arthur and Molly in the front row with a banner that read, "Go Harry," in letters that changed colour every few seconds, Percy with a detailed notebook documenting every play, and the twins leading what sounded like half of Gryffindor House in increasingly creative chants. When Harry caught the golden snitch in a dramatic dive that ended Gryffindor's victory, the first faces he looked for were theirs, and the pride and joy he saw there made the accomplishment feel twice as meaningful. "Did you see that dive?" George was shouting as the family gathered on the pitch after the match. "Spectacular," Fred agreed enthusiastically. "The youngest seeker in a century," Percy said with obvious pride, "and he's our brother." The research into Nicholas Flamel that began in late November took on a different character, with the Weasley family's resources behind it. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione discovered the connection between the mysterious name and the object hidden in the school, Harry's first instinct was to write home for advice. Bill's response was both informative and concerning. "Harry, Nicholas Flamel is the only known creator of the Philosopher's Stone, which grants immortality and turns any metal into pure gold. If such an artifact is hidden at Hogwarts, it's likely because someone is trying to steal it. This is extremely dangerous magic, and you should not attempt to handle it alone. Inform McGonagall immediately, and let trained professionals deal with whatever threat exists. I'm attaching some basic information about protective enchantments that might be relevant, but please promise me you won't attempt to investigate this yourself. You have too much to live for, to risk it on unnecessary heroics. Love. Bill." The conversation with McGonagall that followed was awkward, but necessary. Harry had never been one to run to adults with problems. His childhood had taught him that adults were generally not trustworthy sources of help, but the Weasley family had worked hard to teach him that asking for help was not a sign of weakness. "Professor," he said after Transfiguration class one day, "I think there might be something dangerous hidden in the school, and I'm worried that someone is trying to steal it." McGonagall's eyebrows rose sharply. "What makes you think that, Potter?" Harry explained about the research into Nicholas Flamel and the suspicious activity around the third-floor corridor. McGonagall listened with growing concern, and when he finished, she nodded grimly. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Potter. You were absolutely right to report your concerns rather than attempting to investigate on your own. I will discuss this matter with the appropriate authorities." Christmas at the Burrow was everything Harry had dreamed a family holiday could be. He woke up on Christmas morning to a pile of presents, real presents, from people who had chosen them specifically for him, and the sound of his family moving around downstairs, preparing what Molly had promised would be the best Christmas dinner he had ever had. His presents included a handmade jumper from Molly in emerald green with a golden snitch embroidered on the front, a book about famous seekers from Arthur, joke items from the twins, a detailed guide to advanced transfiguration from Percy, and a beautiful wooden chess set from Ron. "This is the best Christmas I've ever had," Harry said honestly as they sat around the kitchen table after dinner, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of love and acceptance surrounding him. "The first of many, I hope," Arthur replied warmly. That night, unable to sleep from excitement and chocolate, Harry wandered down to the sitting room and found himself face to face with an ornate mirror that had not been there earlier in the day. "The mirror of Erised," Bill said quietly from the doorway. "Dad brought it home from the office. They confiscated it from someone who was using it for rather unhealthy purposes. Dangerous thing, really. Shows you your heart's deepest desire." "What do you see when you look in it?" Harry asked curiously. "Our family. Healthy and happy and together. Which is pretty much what I have already." Bill smiled and ruffled Harry's hair. "That's why the mirror isn't dangerous for me. The problem comes when people see things they can never have and become obsessed with trying to make those visions reality." Harry looked into the mirror and saw exactly what Bill described: the Weasley family, with himself clearly included, surrounded by warmth and love and the comfortable chaos of a house full of people who cared about each other. It was exactly what he already had, and the realization filled him with a contentment so profound it took his breath away. "I see the same thing you do," he told Bill quietly. "Good lad," Bill replied with obvious approval. "That means you understand the difference between dreams and reality, and you appreciate what you have rather than yearning for what you don't." The rest of the Christmas holiday passed in a blur of family activities, meals that lasted for hours, and the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere without reservation. When it was time to return to Hogwarts, Harry felt the familiar pang of missing his family, but also excitement about continuing his education and seeing his school friends again. "Remember," Molly said, as she hugged him goodbye at King's Cross, "you always have a home with us. Whatever happens at school, whatever challenges you face, you're never alone." "I know," Harry replied, and for the first time in his life, he truly meant it. "I love you too, Mum." Back at Hogwarts for the spring term, Harry found that his confidence and sense of security continued to grow. His academic work remained strong, his friendships deepened, and his Quidditch skills improved with each practice. When challenges arose, whether they were academic struggles, social conflicts, or the occasional magical emergency, he faced them with the knowledge that he had people who believed in him and supported him unconditionally. The spring term brought new lessons, new friendships, and new discoveries about his own capabilities. But most importantly, it brought the continued realization that Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people who loved him, engaged in learning that fascinated him, and secure in the knowledge that his future was his own to shape. By the time the Easter holidays arrived, Harry could look back on his first year at Hogwarts with genuine satisfaction. He had not only survived the transition from his traumatic childhood to magical education, he had thrived, and with the continued support of the Weasley family and the friendships he was building at school, he was confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would be ready to meet them. The boy who had once slept in a cupboard under the stairs had become a confident young wizard with a loving family and a bright future. And that, Harry thought as he packed for another holiday at the Burrow, was the best magic of all. Chapter 10. Confronting the Past. The letter from Bill arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, delivered by an official Gringotts owl that looked distinctly agitated. Harry was eating breakfast with Ron and Hermione when the large, tawny bird swooped down to drop the sealed message directly into his porridge, spattering oats across his transfiguration homework. "That's not normal post behavior," Hermione observed, watching the owl drink deeply from Ron's pumpkin juice before flying off without waiting for a reply. Harry broke the Gringotts seal and read Bill's message with growing alarm. "Harry, our family connections at the bank have confirmed that the Philosopher's Stone is definitely at Hogwarts, and there are signs someone has been making serious attempts to steal it." Dad's investigation has turned up some disturbing information about why Dumbledore really wanted the stone there. This is not a coincidence or a simple protective measure. You're being used as bait, and we won't stand for it. Don't do anything dangerous. Adults are handling this now. Dad has called an emergency meeting with the Ministry, and Mum is on her way to school. Whatever Dumbledore is planning, you're not facing it alone. Stay safe. We love you. Bill. What is it? Ron asked, noting Harry's pale expression. Harry handed over the letter, watching his best friend's face change from curiosity to outrage as he read. He's using you as bait? Ron demanded, loudly enough to attract attention from nearby Gryffindor students. That's what Dumbledore does, Harry said, quietly, feeling a familiar cold anger settling in his chest. He makes plans and he uses people to carry them out, and he doesn't ask permission. Hermione, who had been reading the letter over Ron's shoulder, looked up with sharp intelligence in her eyes. The stone isn't just hidden at Hogwarts for protection, is it? It's here to lure someone into making a move, and Dumbledore is counting on you to be involved in stopping them. But I'm 11, Harry said, with the careful calm that his family had learned meant he was furious. I'm 11 years old, and I should be studying for my end-of-year exams, not being used as bait in some elaborate plan to catch dark wizards. Before Ron or Hermione could respond, Professor McGonagall approached the Gryffindor table with purposeful strides and an expression that suggested someone was in serious trouble. Potter, Weasley, Granger, she said crisply. You will come with me immediately. Bring your bags. The walk to McGonagall's office was tense and silent, but Harry noticed that instead of taking them to her usual office, she led them to a larger room where several adults were already waiting. Arthur and Molly Weasley sat at one end of a long table, flanked by two witches Harry recognized as ministry officials from his custody hearing. Dumbledore stood by the window, his usual twinkling demeanor notably absent. Harry, sweetheart, Molly said, rising immediately to pull him into a fierce hug. Are you all right? Have you been in any danger? I'm fine, Mum, Harry replied, and felt some of his tension ease at her familiar warmth. But I think someone needs to explain what's really been going on here. Arthur stood as well, his expression grim. That's exactly what we're here to do. Harry, we've discovered that Professor Dumbledore has been using your presence at Hogwarts as part of an elaborate plan to draw out potential threats. The Philosopher's Stone was placed here specifically to attract the attention of dark wizards, with the expectation that you would somehow become involved in protecting it. Harry turned to look at Dumbledore, who met his gaze with obvious discomfort. Is that true, Professor? Harry, Dumbledore said gently, the situation is more complex than it may appear. Is it true? Harry interrupted, and his voice carried the sort of quiet authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he admitted finally. I believed that placing the stone at Hogwarts would force Voldemort's followers into the open, and that your involvement would help ensure their defeat. I thought it would be an opportunity for you to begin fulfilling your destiny. My destiny, Harry repeated slowly, is to be an 11-year-old boy who goes to school and learns magic and grows up safely with people who love him. It is not to be used as bait in your plans to catch dark wizards. Molly stepped forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Albus, she said with dangerous calm, you promised us that you would not make decisions about Harry's life without including him and his family. This sounds very much like a decision that affects his safety and well-being. Molly, Dumbledore began, I understand your concern, but the greater good. Don't you dare, Molly interrupted, and her voice carried the full force of a mother's protective fury. Don't you dare talk to me about the greater good when you're planning to use a child as bait. Harry is not a weapon for you to deploy against your enemies. He is a little boy who deserves to be safe. One of the Ministry witches cleared her throat. Professor Dumbledore, this committee has been investigating your conduct as headmaster since Mr. Potter's custody case revealed serious concerns about your judgment regarding student welfare. Using a minor child as bait in a plan to capture dangerous criminals represents exactly the sort of reckless endangerment we were concerned about. Amelia, Dumbledore said, addressing the witch directly, surely you understand that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures. What I understand, Amelia Bones replied sharply, is that you have repeatedly demonstrated poor judgment when it comes to Harry Potter's safety and welfare. This latest revelation suggests that pattern is continuing. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor outside, raised voices, running footsteps, and what sounded like spells being cast. McGonagall moved quickly to the door, wand drawn, and peered into the hallway. "There's a disturbance on the 3rd floor," she reported tersely. "It appears someone is attempting to breach the protections around the stone." "Right," Arthur said, standing immediately. "Harry, you stay here with your mother and the ministry officials. Ron, Hermione. The same goes for you. This is a job for trained professionals." But before anyone could move toward the door, Professor Quirrell stumbled into the room, his turban askew and his eyes wild with panic. Behind him, Harry could see the distinctive glow of protective spells that had been activated throughout the castle. "The stone!" Quirrell gasped, apparently unaware of the assembled group. "I must! The Dark Lord commands—" He stopped abruptly as he noticed the room full of adults, his expression shifting from panic to cold calculation in a heartbeat. "Professor Quirrell," Dumbledore said carefully, "perhaps you would like to explain what you've been doing on the 3rd floor." "I think," said Arthur Weasley with deadly calm, "we all know exactly what Professor Quirrell has been doing. The question is how long you've known about it, Albus, and why you allowed it to continue." What followed was less a confrontation than a careful dismantling of Quirrell's defenses by trained professionals who knew how to handle dangerous dark wizards. With Arthur's legal expertise, Amelia Bones' investigative authority, and McGonagall's protective magic all focused on containing the threat, Quirrell found himself overwhelmed before he could mount any serious resistance. The revelation that Voldemort had been possessing the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was shocking but handled with the sort of professional competence that Harry had never experienced in a crisis before. Instead of being thrust into danger, he was protected by adults who knew what they were doing. Instead of facing Voldemort alone, he watched from safety as people with training and authority dealt with the threat appropriately. "Is it over?" Harry asked quietly, as ministry officials led Quirrell away in magical restraints, and curse-breakers from Gringotts began the process of safely removing the Philosopher's Stone from the school. "This part is," Arthur replied, putting a reassuring hand on Harry's shoulder. "But there will likely be consequences for everyone involved in allowing this situation to develop." Those consequences came swiftly. Within a week, a formal ministry investigation was launched into Dumbledore's fitness to serve as headmaster. While the investigation proceeded, new safeguarding measures were implemented at Hogwarts, and Harry found himself with additional protection that felt supportive rather than intrusive. "The important thing," Molly said, during one of her daily visits to check on Harry's well-being, "is that you're safe, and you handled this situation exactly right. You told trusted adults what was happening, you didn't try to handle it alone, and you let people with proper training do their jobs." "I did want to help," Harry admitted. "When I saw Quirrell and realized what was happening, part of me wanted to do something." "Of course you did," Arthur said approvingly. "That's your courage, and your good heart. But courage doesn't mean rushing into danger unnecessarily. It means knowing when to ask for help and to trusting the people who love you to provide it." Harry's end-of-year exams took place in an atmosphere of relative calm, with the crisis resolved and his future secure. Without the stress of isolation, fear, or uncertainty about his living situation, he was able to focus entirely on demonstrating what he had learned during his first year at Hogwarts. His results were excellent. Top marks in transfiguration and charms, solid performance in potions despite the subject's difficulty, and respectable scores across all his subjects. More importantly, his teachers' comments reflected not just academic achievement, but personal growth and social development. Harry Potter has shown remarkable progress this year, Professor McGonagall wrote in her evaluation. His magical ability is considerable, but his greatest strength lies in his judgment and his willingness to seek appropriate help when faced with challenges beyond his experience. He has demonstrated exactly the sort of wisdom and maturity we hope to see in our students. The end-of-term feast was a celebration not just of Gryffindor's House Cup victory, but of Harry's successful completion of his first year as a student who was valued for himself rather than his fame or his utility to others' plans. When Dumbledore announced that the Defense Against the Dark Arts position would be filled by a new professor the following year, and that new security measures would ensure student safety without compromising their education, Harry felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "So," Ron said, as they packed their trunks for the summer holidays, "what are you most excited about for summer?" Harry considered this seriously. "Everything," he said finally. "Spending time with the family, learning more about magic from Bill and the twins, maybe getting better at Quidditch. Just being able to be a normal kid for a few months." "You know," Hermione said thoughtfully, "I don't think most people realize how extraordinary it is to want to be ordinary." "That's because most people haven't spent their childhood being told they were less than ordinary," Harry replied. "Being normal, being loved, being allowed to just exist without having to justify it. That's the most extraordinary thing in the world." As the Hogwarts Express pulled away from the castle, carrying Harry toward another summer with the Weasley family, he reflected on how much had changed since that first night when Arthur and Molly had found him locked in a cupboard. He had faced dark wizards and dangerous magic, but he had faced them with support and backup, and the knowledge that his safety mattered to people who loved him. He had grown into his own power, not the power that others wanted to use for their own purposes, but the power that came from knowing his own worth and having people who would fight to protect his right to grow up safely and happily. And that, Harry thought, as he watched the countryside roll by through the window, was the best magic of all. Chapter 11. Family Bonds. The final custody hearing took place on a warm June morning, exactly 11 months after Arthur and Molly Weasley had first rescued Harry from Privet Drive. Harry sat in the familiar Wizengamot chambers, but this time the proceeding felt more like a celebration than a trial. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal arguments were settled, and everyone present understood that this was simply the formal conclusion of a process that had been emotionally complete for months. In the matter of Potter guardianship, Madame Marchbanks announced from her position as presiding officer, this court finds that the emergency custody granted to Arthur and Molly Weasley has been executed with exceptional care and consideration for the child's welfare. Mr. Potter has thrived under their guardianship, both academically and personally. Harry felt Molly's hand squeeze his gently as they listened to the formal recitation of his progress over the past year. His excellent grades at Hogwarts, his successful integration into the Weasley family structure, his development of healthy friendships and social skills, and most importantly, his obvious happiness and security. Therefore, Madame Marchbanks continued, this court hereby grants permanent legal guardianship of Harry James Potter to Arthur and Molly Weasley, with all rights and responsibilities pertaining thereto. Mr. Potter, do you consent to this arrangement? Harry stood, feeling more confident and self-possessed than he had ever felt in his life. Yes, he said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the chamber. I consent completely. The Weasleys are my family, and I want to be theirs. The formal adoption ceremony that followed 2 weeks later was unlike anything in Harry's experience. Held in the garden of the Burrow on a golden July evening, it combined traditional wizarding bonding magic with the warm, chaotic love that defined the Weasley family approach to everything important. "Are you ready for this, sweetheart?" Molly asked, as they stood together before a ministry official who specialized in family magic. The entire family was gathered around them, Arthur beaming with pride, the children arrayed in order from Bill down to Ginny, all of them radiating joy and excitement. "I've been ready for this my whole life," Harry replied honestly. "I just didn't know what I was waiting for." The magical adoption ceremony was both simple and profound. Ancient spells wove threads of connection between Harry and each member of his new family, creating bonds that went deeper than legal documents or emotional attachments. When the magic settled, Harry could feel the warmth of belonging in his very bones. He was a Weasley now, not just in name, but in the deepest magical sense possible. "Welcome to the family, officially," Arthur said with obvious emotion, pulling Harry into an embrace that felt like coming home. "We couldn't be prouder to call you our son." The conclusion of the Dursley prosecution had been less ceremonial, but equally satisfying. Vernon and Petunia Dursley were sentenced to community service under magical supervision, required to undergo counseling about child welfare, and permanently barred from having custody of or unsupervised contact with any minor children. Most importantly for Harry's peace of mind, they were magically compelled to never speak publicly about him or his circumstances. "Justice," Arthur had said with grim satisfaction when the sentences were announced. Not perfect justice, perhaps, but enough to ensure they can never hurt another child the way they hurt you. "I'm glad it's over," Harry had replied. "I don't need them to be punished as much as I need to know they can't hurt anyone else." The visit to his parents' graves came at Harry's own request, 3 days before his 12th birthday. He had wanted to introduce them, in some symbolic way, to the family who had saved him and loved him back to life. Godric's Hollow was peaceful in the summer afternoon, the small cemetery shaded by ancient trees and filled with the quiet dignity of a place where many generations had come to rest. James and Lily Potter's headstone was simple white marble, inscribed with their names, dates, and the words, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." "Hello, Mum and Dad," Harry said quietly, kneeling beside the grave with Molly and Arthur flanking him. "I wanted you to meet my family. I think you would have liked them." Molly placed a bouquet of lilies beside the headstone, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We'll take good care of him," she promised softly. "We'll make sure he knows how much you loved him, and we'll love him just as much." Arthur's voice was gentle when he spoke. "James, Lily, your son has grown into someone you would be incredibly proud of. He's brave and kind and good, and he knows his own worth now. He's going to be all right." Harry felt a profound sense of peace as they stood together in the quiet cemetery. His parents would always be his parents, and their love would always be part of him. But the Weasleys were his family now, the people who would shape his future and celebrate his achievements and worry about his happiness. Both truths could exist together, and somehow that made both of them more precious. Back at the Burrow, the summer settled into a comfortable routine that felt as natural as breathing. Harry's magical abilities continued to develop under the gentle guidance of his family, each of whom contributed something different to his education. Bill taught him about curse detection and protective magic, sharing professional techniques that went far beyond what Hogwarts covered in its regular curriculum. "The key," Bill explained as they practiced shield charms in the orchard, "is intent rather than power. You're not trying to overpower an attack. You're trying to redirect it or absorb it harmlessly. Think of it like water flowing around a stone." Harry's shield charm shimmered into existence, solid and steady despite his young age. Like this? Exactly like that. You've got natural protective instincts, Harry. Probably comes from spending so much of your childhood having to defend yourself in other ways. The twins contributed a different sort of magical education, teaching Harry about the creative applications of magic that professors rarely discussed. Their summer project involved developing new variants of joke items, and they included Harry in both the theoretical development and the practical testing. Magic doesn't have to be serious to be powerful, Fred explained, as they worked on color-changing caramels in the garden shed they had converted into a laboratory. Some of the most effective magic is the kind that catches people off guard because they're not expecting it. Besides, George added with a grin, learning to think creatively about magic will help you in all your classes. Professors love students who approach problems from unexpected angles. Percy's contribution was more academic but equally valuable. He had appointed himself Harry's tutor for advanced theoretical magic, working with him on concepts that wouldn't be covered at Hogwarts for several more years. You're quite gifted at transfiguration theory, Percy observed, as they worked through increasingly complex problems at the kitchen table. Have you given any thought to what you might want to specialize in after Hogwarts? Harry looked up from the essay he was writing about the ethical implications of permanent human transfiguration. I've been thinking about it more lately, he admitted. I like the idea of helping people somehow. Maybe becoming a healer or working in magical law enforcement like Dad. Both excellent choices, Percy said approvingly. And with your academic record, you'd have your pick of training programs. Even Ron and Ginny contributed to Harry's magical education in their own ways. Ron by sharing everything he had learned about magical culture and traditions from growing up in the wizarding world, and Ginny by offering a different perspective on magic that was less concerned with formal education and more focused on intuitive understanding. Magic isn't just about spells and theory, Ginny explained one evening as they sat on the hillside behind the Burrow, watching the sun set over the countryside. It's about understanding how everything connects to everything else. Mum's cooking magic, the way Dad can fix anything mechanical just by touching it, the way the house itself feels happy when we're all home together. That's all magic too. Harry's 12th birthday celebration was everything he had ever dreamed a birthday could be. He woke up to the smell of his favorite breakfast cooking downstairs, came down to find presents wrapped in bright paper and cards from friends at school, and spent the day surrounded by people who were genuinely excited to celebrate another year of his life. 12 years old, Molly said wonderingly, as she served the elaborate birthday cake she had spent 2 days preparing. It hardly seems possible. It feels like yesterday that we found you, and at the same time, it feels like you've always been part of this family. That's because I have always been part of this family, Harry replied, with the sort of profound contentment that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. I just had to find my way home. The presents were thoughtful and personal in a way that reflected how well his family knew and understood him. Arthur gave him a book about the intersection of magical and muggle technology, acknowledging Harry's interest in both worlds. Molly had knitted him a new Quidditch jumper in Gryffindor colours with his name and number embroidered on the back. Bill contributed a professional-grade set of curse detection tools, scaled down for someone Harry's age but fully functional. The twins presented him with a Marauder's map, not the original, which they admitted they didn't have, but their own version that showed the Burrow and surrounding area in incredible detail. Percy gave him an advanced set of reference books that would serve him well throughout his Hogwarts career. Ron offered a collection of chocolate frog cards featuring famous Quidditch players, and Ginny shyly presented him with a hand-drawn book of magical creatures that demonstrated considerable artistic talent. "This is the best birthday I've ever had," Harry said, as the evening wound down and the family gathered in the sitting room for the traditional end-of-birthday storytelling. Actually, it's the best birthday I could have ever imagined having. The first of many, I hope, Arthur replied warmly. We're looking forward to celebrating many more with you, Harry. As July gave way to August, the family began preparing for Harry's second year at Hogwarts with the sort of excited planning that had become routine over the past year. This time, there was no uncertainty about Harry's place in the world, or anxiety about whether he would be welcomed back. He was a Weasley now, with a loving family to support him and a bright future stretching ahead of him. I can't wait for you to meet our new defense against the dark arts, Professor, Ron said enthusiastically as they organized their school supplies. And I heard there are going to be new protections around the school after what happened last year. Good, Harry replied firmly. Students shouldn't have to worry about dangerous artifacts being hidden in their school. We should be able to focus on learning magic, not wondering if we're being used as bait for dark wizards. Molly looked up from the robes she was mending, her expression proud and fond. That's exactly the sort of attitude I like to hear, she said approvingly. You know your own worth now, and you know you deserve to be safe and protected. That's the most important magic of all. On the evening before their departure for King's Cross Station, Harry sat in his room. Ron's room, technically, but it had become truly theirs over the past year, packing his trunk and reflecting on the incredible transformation his life had undergone. 12 months ago, he had been a frightened, confused boy who had never experienced love or kindness. Now he was confident, secure, and surrounded by people who would fight to protect his right to be happy. Ready for second year? Ron asked, settling on his own bed with the comfortable familiarity of a brother and best friend. More than ready, Harry replied with complete honesty. I feel like I can handle whatever comes next, as long as I know I have all of you behind me. Always, Ron said seriously. That's what families do. Harry smiled, folding his new school robes carefully into his trunk. Tomorrow would bring new adventures and new challenges, but it would also bring them as a member of a family that loved him unconditionally. And that, he thought, as he prepared for sleep, made him capable of facing anything the future might hold. He was Harry Potter Weasley now, beloved son and brother, student and friend, and someone with agency over his own destiny. The boy who had once slept in a cupboard under the stairs was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew his own worth and had people who would defend it with their lives. And that was the most powerful magic of all. Chapter 12. New Horizons. The morning of September 1st dawned bright and clear, with the sort of crisp autumn air that promised new beginnings and fresh adventures. Harry woke naturally in the bed that had become truly his over the past year, listening to the familiar sounds of the Burrow preparing for another Hogwarts departure. Molly calling instructions up the stairs, Arthur checking train schedules, the twins arguing over who had packed whose telescope. But this year was different. This year, Harry was not the uncertain, overwhelmed boy who had stumbled through his first departure from King's Cross Station. This year, he was Harry Potter Weasley, beloved son and brother, confident student and loyal friend, someone who knew exactly where he belonged and exactly how much he was valued. Ready for second year? Ron asked from his own bed, though the question was more ritual than inquiry. They had been ready for weeks, their trunks packed with the sort of methodical care that came from experience, their excitement tempered by the comfortable knowledge that Hogwarts was a second home rather than an uncertain destination. More than ready, Harry replied with genuine enthusiasm, rolling out of bed and reaching for the clothes that Molly had laid out for him the night before. Clothes that fit properly, clothes that were his own, clothes that reflected the care and attention of someone who loved him. I can't wait to see Hermione again, and find out who our new defense professor is, and start learning more advanced magic. The breakfast table was the usual cheerful chaos of a Weasley family meal, but Harry noticed the undercurrents of emotion that always accompanied major departures. Molly was fussing more than usual over everyone's eating habits. Arthur was making detailed lists of things to remember, and even the twins seemed more subdued than their typical morning energy. "Now, you'll write every week," Molly said, for what had to be the fourth time that morning, pressing another packet of sandwiches into Harry's hands. "I want to know how your classes are going, if you're getting enough sleep, whether the new defense professor is competent." "Mum," Harry interrupted gently, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I promise I'll write. I'll tell you everything that's important, and I'll ask for help if I need it. You've taught me how to do that now." The pride and love in Molly's eyes made Harry's chest tight with emotion. "Yes," she said softly. "We have, haven't we? Sometimes I can hardly believe how much you've grown." The trip to Diagon Alley for last-minute supplies was a stark contrast to Harry's experience the previous year. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the magical environment or uncertain about his place in it, Harry moved through the crowded streets with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He knew which shops sold the best quills, which bookstores had the most comprehensive collections, which vendors to trust, and which to avoid with polite skepticism. At Flourish and Blots, they encountered the new defense against the dark arts professor, Gilderoy Lockhart, holding court at a book signing surrounded by excited witches and an alarming number of flashing cameras. Harry watched the spectacle with interest rather than intimidation, noting the way Lockhart's eyes immediately sought out anyone who might provide good publicity. "Harry Potter!" Lockhart exclaimed when he spotted them, his smile so bright it was almost blinding. "What an absolute delight! Come here, my boy. Let's get a photograph for the Prophet." Before Harry could respond, Arthur stepped smoothly between them, his expression polite but unmistakably protective. "Professor Lockhart, how lovely to meet you. I'm Arthur Weasley, Harry's father. Perhaps we could arrange a more private introduction once the term begins. I'm sure you understand our preference for keeping Harry's public exposure to a minimum." Harry felt a warm surge of gratitude for Arthur's intervention. A year ago, he wouldn't have known how to handle Lockhart's overwhelming attention, wouldn't have understood that he had the right to decline unwanted publicity, wouldn't have had anyone to protect him from exploitation. Now, he simply smiled politely and allowed his father to manage the situation with diplomatic skill. Of course," Lockhart replied, though his smile dimmed slightly. "Student welfare must come first, naturally, though I do hope we'll have opportunities to work together this year. So much to learn from each other, I'm sure." "I'm sure Harry will benefit greatly from your expertise," Arthur replied smoothly, guiding his family away from the crowd with practiced ease. "Pompous git," Fred muttered under his breath once they were safely out of earshot. "Absolutely," George agreed. "Did you see the way he was posing for those cameras?" "Now, boys," Molly said mildly, but Harry could see she was fighting back a smile. "We shouldn't judge the man before we've given him a chance to prove himself." Though it wouldn't hurt to be cautious, Arthur added quietly to Harry. "Some people are more interested in being associated with your fame than in actually teaching you anything useful." Harry nodded, appreciating both the warning and the confidence that he could handle whatever challenges Lockhart might present. "I'll be careful," he promised, "and I'll talk to you if anything seems wrong." Platform 9 3/4 was as magical as ever, but this year Harry approached the barrier with calm excitement rather than nervous anticipation. He was no longer the boy who had needed help finding his way to the magical platform. He was someone who belonged in both worlds, someone who could navigate the complexities of magical society with confidence and support. The family send-off was everything Harry could have hoped for and more. Molly pulled him into a fierce hug that lasted just long enough to convey all her love and pride without embarrassing him in front of his school friends. Arthur shook his hand with the formal dignity that acknowledged Harry's growing maturity while still conveying paternal affection. "Take care of yourself, son," Arthur said seriously. Remember everything we've taught you about asking for help and trusting your instincts. You've got good judgment now. Use it." "I will, Dad," Harry replied, and felt the deep satisfaction of meaning every word. "Thank you for everything." Bill, who had taken time off work to see them off, ruffled Harry's hair with brotherly affection. "Stay out of trouble, little brother. Or at least, if you can't stay out of trouble, make sure you've got backup. And remember," Percy added with his characteristic earnestness, "second year is when the academic work really begins to intensify. Don't hesitate to ask if you need study assistance." The twins' farewell was typically chaotic and involved several suspicious packages being slipped into Harry's trunk when they thought no one was looking. "Emergency supplies," Fred explained with a wink. "For educational purposes only," George added solemnly. Even Ginny, who would start at Hogwarts herself the following year, hugged him goodbye with obvious emotion. "I'll miss you," she said quietly. "It won't be the same around the house without all my brothers." "I'll miss you too," Harry replied honestly. "But I'll be back for Christmas before you know it, and then we'll all be at school together next year." As the Hogwarts Express pulled away from the platform, Harry leaned out the window to wave goodbye to his family until they disappeared from view. But instead of the sadness he might once have felt at leaving people he loved, he felt only the warm anticipation of someone who knew exactly where home was, and exactly how welcomed he would be when he returned. The train journey passed pleasantly, filled with comfortable conversation with Ron and Hermione about their summers, their expectations for the new term, and their shared amusement at some of the more outrageous claims in Lockhart's assigned textbooks. "Do you really think he fought off those vampires single-handedly?" Hermione asked skeptically, holding up one of Lockhart's books. "I think," Harry replied thoughtfully, "that my family has taught me to be suspicious of anyone who claims to have done amazing things without any witnesses or evidence. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is." "Very wise," Ron agreed. "Dad says the same thing about politicians and people selling miracle cures." That evening, settled into his familiar bed in the Gryffindor dormitory, Harry wrote his first letter home from his second year at Hogwarts. "Dear Mum and Dad, and everyone. The train journey was lovely, and I'm safely settled back at Hogwarts. Our new defense professor is interesting. I think your advice about being cautious around people who are too eager for publicity is going to be very relevant this year. I'll keep you posted on how his classes go. Ron and Hermione are both well, and we're excited to start our second-year classes. I've already started reading ahead in Transfiguration, and I think Percy was right about the academic work getting more challenging. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you again for the most wonderful summer and the best send-off anyone could ask for. I know I'll miss you all terribly, but I also know that I'll be home for Christmas before I know it, and that makes it much easier to focus on school. I love you all so much." Harry, over the following weeks, Harry's letters home painted a picture of a young man who was thriving academically and socially, who approached challenges with confidence and wisdom, and who continued to grow into someone his family could be proud of. His academic performance was excellent, his friendships were strong and healthy, and his ability to navigate the complexities of magical education and adolescent social dynamics reflected the security and self-knowledge he had developed over the past year. When challenges arose, whether they were academic struggles, social conflicts, or the occasional reminder that some people were more interested in his fame than his friendship, Harry handled them with the sort of thoughtful maturity that comes from knowing you are valued for yourself and that you have people who will support you unconditionally. Even his interactions with Dumbledore reflected the new dynamic that had developed between them. The headmaster treated Harry with respectful courtesy, consulting him about decisions that affected his welfare, and accepting Harry's growing independence with what appeared to be genuine approval. "Mr. Potter," Dumbledore said one evening when they encountered each other in the corridors, "you seem to be settling into your second year very well. I trust you are finding the academic work suitably challenging." "Yes, sir," Harry replied politely. "I'm enjoying the opportunity to build on what I learned last year." "Excellent. And I hope you know that my door is always open if you need guidance or support." "Thank you, Professor. I appreciate that." Harry paused, considering his words carefully. "I think I'm learning to recognize when I need help and how to ask for it appropriately. My family has been very good at teaching me that." "Indeed they have," Dumbledore replied, with what sounded like genuine warmth. "You are very fortunate to have such devoted guardians, Harry, and they are fortunate to have you." As October arrived, and Harry settled into the familiar rhythms of academic life, he found himself looking forward to the Christmas holidays with eager anticipation rather than desperate need. He missed his family, certainly, but it was the comfortable missing of someone who knew exactly where home was and exactly how welcomed he would be when he returned. His letters continued to flow back and forth with the Burrow, full of detailed accounts of his classes, his friendships, his small triumphs, and minor setbacks. The responses he received were equally detailed, full of pride in his accomplishments and gentle advice for handling challenges, practical suggestions for academic success, and emotional support for the inevitable difficulties of growing up. Most importantly, Harry's correspondence with his family reflected the healthy communication patterns they had worked so hard to establish: honest sharing of both positive and negative experiences, requests for advice when needed, and the deep security that comes from knowing you are loved unconditionally. By the time November arrived, Harry Potter had become exactly what Arthur and Molly Weasley had hoped he could become when they first found him locked in a cupboard at 4 Privet Drive. A confident, happy, secure young man who knew his own worth and had people who would defend his right to live as well as survive. He was no longer the traumatized boy who had survived on scraps and slept in a cupboard. He was no longer the uncertain child who had been shuffled from one guardian to another without consultation or consideration. He was Harry Potter Weasley, beloved son and brother, accomplished student and loyal friend, someone with agency over his own future, and people who would support whatever choices he made. As he prepared for his first Quidditch match of the season, surrounded by teammates who respected his skill and friends who celebrated his successes, Harry reflected on the incredible transformation his life had undergone. 13 months ago, he had been a boy who expected nothing and received less. Now he was someone who knew he deserved love and kindness, and had found both in abundance. The future stretched ahead of him, bright with possibility and rich with potential. He would continue to grow and learn and discover who he wanted to become. He would face challenges and overcome them, with the support of people who believed in him. He would make his own choices about his career, his relationships, his goals and dreams. Most importantly, he would do all of this as someone who knew he was loved, someone who understood his own worth, someone who had been saved by the simple, revolutionary act of being treated with kindness and respect. Harry Potter had found his family, his home, and himself. And that, he thought, as he prepared to take the field for another Quidditch match in front of people who cheered for his success, was the most powerful magic of all. The boy who had once slept in a cupboard under the stairs was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew that he deserved nothing less than the love and support he had found with the Weasley family. And his future, bright and full of promise, was finally and completely his own. April 23rd.